A retired soldier, once ready to leave war behind, is pulled back into the fight when a commercial flight is hijacked mid-air. What seems like a ransom operation quickly unravels into something far more sinister. A meticulously planned attack meant to be the first step in a global shift of power. As the plane is reclaimed, the real threat emerges. A second aircraft, a missing flight carrying something far worse than hostages. Partnering with a sharp but battle-worn detective, a former mercenary questioning his loyalties, and a young man caught in the crossfire, the soldier follows the trail to a hidden war, one involving rogue military factions, bioengineered weapons, and a man from his past orchestrating chaos from the shadows. Each step forward reveals another layer of deception, and every victory comes at a cost. As the stakes rise, they must decide how far they're willing to go to stop a war before it begins. But in a game this big, one question remains: have they already lost? Hold on a moment before we move forward. Let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if you're loving these stories, don't forget to hit subscribe. Tomorrow's episode is going to be absolutely mind-blowing. At 35,000 feet, the world below was nothing but darkness and distant city lights. The American Airlines Flight 417 from Los Angeles to New York had settled into the dull monotony of a red-eye flight. Passengers were either asleep or pretending to be, the gentle hum of the engines masking quiet conversations and the occasional clink of an ice cube against a plastic cup. For most, it was just another routine flight. For Frank Dawson, it was a quiet moment in a life that had known too little peace. The 92-year-old World War II veteran sat by the window in seat 14A, his hands folded neatly in his lap. His grey eyes, still sharp despite the years, watched the world drift below. His face was lined with time, each wrinkle a roadmap of battles fought and lost, some in war, others in life. He had learned long ago that silence was its own kind of armor. He shifted slightly, stretching the stiff knee that had carried him across the battlefields of Europe. He had seen terror in its purest form, had watched men break under the weight of war, and had stood when others fell. But tonight, Frank wasn't thinking about the past. He was just an old soldier on a plane, heading to New York for a quiet visit with his granddaughter. Nothing more. Or so he thought. A few rows ahead, Dana Reyes, an off-duty LAPD detective, was sipping lukewarm coffee, her sharp eyes scanning the cabin out of habit. A decade in law enforcement had taught her that instincts were rarely wrong, and something about tonight's flight felt off. She couldn't place it. Not yet, but years of chasing criminals through the streets of Los Angeles had sharpened her senses. She knew when trouble was brewing. And trouble had just boarded the plane. 5 men, dressed like businessmen but carrying the weight of something far darker, had entered just before takeoff. They moved with a controlled swagger, like predators who knew the hunt was already over. They spread out across the cabin, each one taking a different seat, rows 7C, 10B, 18D, 23A, and 26F, positioning themselves with military precision. They didn't talk, didn't acknowledge each other, but Dana saw it, the small nod exchanged between 7C and 18D. A signal, a confirmation. And then there was the leader. He sat in first class, his leather jacket unzipped just enough to reveal a glimpse of a tattoo on his collarbone. A black reaper, clutching a scythe, her stomach twisted. The Black Reapers, a notorious motorcycle gang that had grown from a small-time crew running stolen bikes to one of the most dangerous organized crime syndicates in the country. Guns, drugs, and murder followed them like shadows, and now they were on this flight. She exhaled slowly, trying to suppress the alarm rising in her chest. It could have been coincidence, but Dana didn't believe in coincidence, not in her line of work. Across the aisle, Frank Dawson noticed it too. He had been watching people his whole life. You don't survive 3 wars without learning to read men. And these weren't men who belonged on a routine flight to New York. They were soldiers, and soldiers didn't sit with their backs exposed. They didn't take random seats. They took positions. Frank's grip on the armrest tightened. Something was coming. At 38,000 feet, there is nowhere to run. As the plane leveled out, a tense silence fell over the cabin. A flight attendant passed by, oblivious to the storm about to break. Razor, the Black Reaper's ruthless leader, checked his watch. It was time. With a single glance toward his men, the plan was set in motion, and within minutes, Flight 417 would no longer belong to the passengers. It would belong to the Black Reapers. The cabin lights dimmed, casting long shadows over the narrow aisles. Passengers, lost in their own worlds, scrolled through their phones, watched in-flight movies, or dozed under airline blankets. The atmosphere was quiet, peaceful even, a perfect illusion. Frank Dawson had seen this before, the calm before the ambush, and then the storm hit. It started with a scream. A woman in 19F jolted upright, her terrified gasp slicing through the sleepy hush of the cabin. Before anyone could react, a man, one of the Black Reapers, had his arm wrapped around her throat, a knife pressed against her ribs. A second later, chaos erupted. A sharp bang echoed through the cabin as the Reaper in 7C fired a round into the ceiling. A few rows behind him, his partner in 10B lunged toward a flight attendant, forcing her to her knees in the aisle. The air filled with screams, gasps, and the hurried rustling of bodies as passengers ducked, hands raised, eyes wide with panic. "Everyone stay in your goddamn seats!" The voice boomed through the plane, filled with the kind of authority that came from a man used to giving orders. Frank's eyes snapped to the first-class section. Razor, the leader of the Black Reapers, stood near the cockpit door, his presence swallowing the space around him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his leather jacket unzipped just enough to show his gang's insignia. A skeletal Reaper with hollow, dead eyes. In his right hand he held a Glock 19, the barrel still warm from the warning shot. His left hand clenched a homemade explosive, its detonator a crude thumb trigger. "You listen and you live," Razor announced, his voice as cold as steel. "You resist, and I start dropping bodies." The cabin fell into an eerie silence. In less than 60 seconds, Flight 417 no longer belonged to the passengers. It belonged to the Black Reapers. Dana Reyes didn't move. She sat perfectly still, controlling her breathing, her instincts screaming at her to act, to reach for the gun she wasn't carrying, to charge the man in front of her. But rushing in would get people killed. So, she observed, there were 5 hijackers, just as she had suspected. Razor was the leader, but the one to worry about was 18D, a hulking, tattooed man with dead eyes, the enforcer. Men like him didn't hesitate. Men like him enjoyed the violence. Her eyes flicked toward the air marshal, seated 2 rows ahead. The middle-aged man was sweating through his shirt, his gun still holstered, his fingers twitching over the buckle of his seatbelt. He wasn't ready. He was a liability. Dana inhaled slowly, pressing her back against the seat. This wasn't a robbery. If it were, the hijackers would have demanded money, valuables. But they weren't interested in wallets. They were after something bigger, and that's what terrified her. Frank Dawson had already figured it out. This wasn't about ransom money. It was about leverage, hostages, collateral. And that meant the people on this plane were not just passengers anymore. They were bargaining chips. Frank's mind moved like it used to in war, calculating angles, positioning, opportunities for resistance. He assessed the hijackers one by one. Razor, the leader, controlled, tactical. His finger rested on the trigger, but he wasn't nervous. 18D, the enforcer, violent, unpredictable. A problem. 10B and 23A, the soldiers, following orders, trained but not leaders. 26F, the weak link, young, twitchy, scared. Weak links break. Frank shifted in his seat, his old joints creaking. He caught Dana's eye across the aisle. She knew, he knew, and without a single word, they formed an unspoken alliance. Razor stepped forward, pacing the narrow aisle like a predator patrolling his kill. His eyes swept across the passengers, assessing, sorting, looking for problems. His gaze landed on Frank, an old man, harmless. Razor barely gave him a second look before moving on. Then he reached first class, stopping beside an elderly businessman in a tailored suit. "You," Razor said, voice low. The man flinched, his glasses slipping down his nose. Razor leaned in, close enough for the businessman to smell the cigarettes and leather on his breath. "Give me your phone." The man fumbled in his pocket, hands shaking as he handed over his iPhone. One by one, the Reapers moved through the plane, collecting every phone, every tablet, anything that could send a signal. They were cutting them off. No contact with the outside world, no chance to call for help. Frank watched carefully. 26F, the weak link, hesitated. The young hijacker looked nervous, his hands trembling as he yanked a phone from a woman's grip. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't a killer. Frank filed that away. Then, the first casualty fell. A man in row 21, a Wall Street type, mid-40s, too confident for his own good, rose from his seat. "This is insane," he snapped. "You're not getting away with this." Razor sighed. "Sit down. I'm not afraid of you." The words barely left his mouth before Razor lifted his gun and fired. The shot echoed through the cabin, and the businessman collapsed against his seat, blood spilling down his crisp white shirt. Screams erupted, people cried out, and suddenly there was no illusion left. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't a standoff. This was war, and Frank Dawson had been fighting wars his whole life. Dana didn't flinch. She had seen men die before. She clenched her fists, pressing them against her thighs, forcing herself to remain still. The plan was forming. Frank was watching the weak link. Dana was watching the enforcer. They needed allies, and time was running out. As Razor reloaded his weapon, Frank made a decision. If they were going to survive, they couldn't wait for a rescue. They had to take this plane back themselves. The air inside Flight 417 was suffocating, not because of altitude, but because death had just made itself known. The Wall Street businessman lay slumped in his seat, his blood seeping into the carpet, the scent sharp and metallic. A woman sobbed 2 rows behind him, muffling her cries behind trembling hands. Others stared ahead, paralyzed with shock. And Razor, the Black Reaper's leader, stood in the aisle calm as ever, reloading his gun like he had just swatted a fly. Frank Dawson barely moved. His mind, however, was moving fast. He had seen this exact moment before, on the battlefields of France, in the jungle heat of Vietnam, and in the unforgiving deserts of the Middle East. The first death was a message, a demonstration. It was meant to break them. But soldiers don't break that easily. Dana Reyes saw it too. She had spent years dealing with criminals like Razor. She knew men like him lived for control, the way he held himself, the way his men followed his every move without question, told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't just a hijacking. Razor had a bigger plan, but plans have weaknesses. Dana shifted slightly in her seat, her fingers brushing against the plastic buckle of her seatbelt. They had to fight back, and that meant gathering allies. She looked at Frank, and Frank looked back. A soldier, a cop, a silent agreement passed between them. The war had begun. The Black Reapers tightened their grip. The other passengers were terrified. Most kept their heads down, too scared to even breathe too loudly. That was exactly what the Reapers wanted. One by one, the hijackers moved through the cabin, barking orders, stripping passengers of any remaining phones, watches, anything with a signal. They were cutting them off completely. In row 16, a young woman in her 20s, pale and shaking, clutched her stomach, whispering frantic prayers. Across the aisle, a man in a business suit clenched his jaw so tightly his teeth might break, his fists trembling with rage. And just behind them, a young Marine on leave, seat 22C, sat rigid, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrest. Potential allies. Frank filed that away. Frank assesses the enemy. Frank's old soldier's instincts kicked in, analyzing the enemy like he had done in countless wars. Razor, the leader, smart, dangerous, focused. He had killed without hesitation, which meant he'd do it again if pushed. 18D, the enforcer. Big, trained, the most physically dangerous. He needed to go first when the time came. 10B and 23A, the soldiers. Disciplined but not leaders. Following orders, 26F, the weak link. Young, nervous, shifting uneasily. The kid wasn't ready for this. Weak links break, and Frank Dawson knew exactly how to break them. Dana takes the first step. Dana didn't wait. Waiting got people killed. As one of the Reapers moved down the aisle, collecting watches and wallets, she made her move. "Hey!" she called out, her voice casual like she was ordering coffee. The Reaper, 10B, snapped his head toward her. Dana tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "You look military." 10B hesitated. Razor's men weren't amateurs. They had discipline, but discipline came from somewhere. Dana had seen it before. Marine, Army, Special Forces. Whoever he was trained, and trained men follow patterns. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes searching for a response. A flicker of recognition, a hesitation, and she got it. 10B's posture stiffened, just for a second. That was all Dana needed. The first sign of resistance. As 10B continued moving, Dana locked eyes with Frank across the aisle. Now they had something. 10B wasn't just a thug. He had a past, and that meant he could be manipulated. Frank nodded slightly. He understood, but they needed more. Their small resistance force had to grow. They needed numbers, and time was running out. The turning point, Razor's real plan, is revealed. The Reapers had control now, but that wasn't enough. Razor stepped forward, his cold eyes scanning the cabin. Then he spoke. "Here's what's gonna happen," he said. His voice calm, measured, like a businessman explaining a contract. "You're gonna sit here and behave while we finish our job. No one plays hero. No one makes a move. You stay quiet and you go home." Frank didn't believe him. Neither did Dana. The first kill had been for control, but that wasn't the end of it. This was bigger than just ransom. And then Dana saw it. The Reaper in 23A had something tucked inside his jacket. She caught a glimpse of the patch, a symbol she had seen before in LAPD case files. It wasn't just the Black Reapers involved. It was bigger. This wasn't a simple hijacking. This was organized terrorism. Frank makes his move. Frank exhaled slowly, his mind flashing back decades. He had spent his life fighting evil, men like Razor who thought power came from a gun, and he had spent his life proving them wrong. The plan was forming. 1. Identify more allies. 2. Find a way to get weapons. 3. Neutralize the threats one by one. His fingers flexed against the armrest. The old soldier wasn't done fighting yet. Dana's moment of realization. Dana had always been a fighter, but now she understood. This wasn't just survival. This was war, and she was going to win. She locked eyes with Frank once more. They were in this together now. No turning back. The resistance had begun. The stale air inside Flight 417 felt heavier with every passing second. Fear had settled into the passengers, weighing them down like chains. People shrank into their seats, eyes fixed forward, terrified of drawing attention. The Black Reapers had established dominance. But dominance wasn't enough. Control wasn't enough. Not for men like Razor. Frank Dawson knew this type. He had fought them before, in different uniforms, in different wars. They all carried the same sickness. The hunger for power, the belief that fear was a weapon that never dulled. But Frank had learned something long ago. Fear is a fire, and fire, if not carefully controlled, spreads. He sat still, his old fingers tracing invisible patterns on the armrest. His knee ached, but he ignored it. His mind moved like it always had in combat, assessing, calculating. He had seen these hijackers up close now. Razor, the leader. The one they called 18D, the enforcer, brutal and eager. 10B and 23A, the soldiers, disciplined but following orders. And 26F, the weak link. Weak links break. Across the aisle, Dana Reyes was doing her own calculations. Years in law enforcement had taught her to recognize a hostage situation, but this was more than that. This was orchestrated, rehearsed. These men had done this before, or at the very least, trained for it. Their movements were too precise, their coordination too smooth for a random gang hijacking. And then there was the real giveaway. The way Razor hadn't made any demands yet, a hijacking like this. They should have been on the radio with air traffic control by now, laying out their demands, asking for money, a landing spot, an escape plan. Instead, Razor was just waiting. That meant there was more to this than ransom. Dana kept her breathing steady, her hands folded in her lap. Her Glock was in her checked baggage. Useless now. The air marshal had a gun, but he was sitting frozen, paralyzed by indecision. That made him more of a problem than an asset. If she was going to take this plane back, she needed people she could trust, and she needed a plan. She glanced at Frank. He already knew. They had never spoken before this flight. But Dana recognized something in his eyes, the same thing she saw in her own reflection after a long shift. This man had been through hell, and he had come out the other side, still willing to fight. She gave him the smallest nod. Frank's return nod was even smaller. The war had begun. They had to move fast. The longer the Reapers felt in control, the harder it would be to take that control away. But they couldn't act alone. They needed numbers. Frank glanced around, looking for potential allies. Some passengers were too frozen with fear. Some were quietly weeping, whispering prayers. They couldn't count on those. They needed people with discipline. Frank's eyes landed on seat 22C, a young Marine, early 20s, muscles taut as a wire. His jaw was clenched, his posture perfect, his hands gripping the armrests so hard his knuckles were white. He wasn't just afraid, he was waiting. Frank recognized that look. It was the look of a soldier forced to sit still while the enemy controlled the battlefield. He needed to bring him in. Meanwhile, Dinah's eyes landed on a flight attendant near the galley. She was young, maybe mid-20s, but she wasn't crying. Instead, she was breathing slowly, deliberately. She had a look Dana recognized, a woman trying to hold herself together long enough to act. She was another one. That made four: Frank, Dana, the Marine, and the flight attendant. Not enough, but a start. The key now was timing. They couldn't just rush the hijackers. That was suicide. They needed to break them down piece by piece, starting with the weak link, 26F. Frank focused on him now, focused on watching the way his hands trembled as he clutched his rifle. The kid was barely 20, his skin pale, his breathing uneven. He kept glancing toward Razor, waiting for approval, waiting for guidance. He wasn't a soldier, he was a follower. And followers can be turned. Frank leaned slightly toward him, just enough to catch his eye. The kid flinched, tightening his grip on the gun. "Son," Frank said, voice low. 26F jerked, eyes wide. "Shut up." Frank didn't flinch. He kept his voice steady even. "You don't want to do this." "I said shut up." Frank didn't shut up. "You ever killed a man before?" he asked, his voice just above a whisper. 26F's hands tightened around the weapon. That was the tell. No, he hadn't, and he didn't want to. Frank leaned in just a fraction more. "Because I have, and I can tell you if you do it, it's never going to leave you. It's not just blood on your hands. It's in your mind, in your chest. You close your eyes and you still see it." 26F's breathing hitched. Frank had his attention now. Frank lowered his voice even more, barely a whisper. "They're using you, son. You think they'll care what happens to you when this is over?" 26F swallowed hard. He was cracking, and Frank was going to break him. Dana saw what Frank was doing, and she knew exactly how to play her part. She turned her attention back to 10B, the one who had reacted when she mentioned the military. She needed to plant a seed, just like Frank was doing with 26F. She leaned back in her seat, making her voice low but firm. "Hey, 10B, right?" He turned his head sharply. "What?" Dana kept her eyes calm, focused. "You served, didn't you?" 10B's jaw clenched, but he didn't answer. "You know what this is," she continued. "You know where this goes. It doesn't end clean, doesn't end simple. So tell me, what's your exit plan? That hit something. He blinked. A hesitation. That was all Dana needed. You got a family? She pressed. Someone waiting for you? 10B didn't answer, but Dana saw the flicker in his eyes. He wasn't like Razor. He wasn't a killer. That meant he could be swayed. Frank was working on 26F. Dana was working on 10B. Piece by piece. They were pulling at the seams of the Black Reapers. They just needed one good spark to make it all unravel. And that spark was coming. Because up ahead, in the cockpit, something was happening. Razor had disappeared behind the reinforced door 5 minutes ago. And when he came out, his expression had changed. He was tense now, agitated. Whatever had just happened up there, it wasn't part of his plan. Dana saw it. Frank saw it. And both of them knew what it meant. Something had gone wrong for the hijackers. And when criminals panic, they make mistakes. That meant the time to strike was coming. Frank exhaled slowly, his fingers flexing against the armrest. Not yet, but soon. And when it came, they would be ready. Because soldiers don't go down without a fight. They just needed the right moment to start the war. And that moment was coming fast. The air inside Flight 417 was thick with fear, but beneath that fear, something else was forming. A crack in the foundation of control the Black Reapers had built. It was small, almost invisible, but to a trained eye, it was there, a fracture. And Frank Dawson had spent his life finding fractures and breaking them wide open. He didn't move yet. Movement drew attention. Instead, he watched. 26F, the young one, was still shaken from their earlier exchange. The way his hands flexed around the grip of his rifle, the way his gaze darted to Razor like a child looking for reassurance. He wasn't made for this. Frank had seen it in young soldiers before. Some men could kill. Some men couldn't. And some men thought they could, right up until the moment they were forced to prove it. That kid was on the edge. Frank just had to push him the rest of the way. Across the aisle, Dana Reyes was working her own angle. 10B, the one who had flinched when she called him out for his military past, had gone quiet. He wasn't acting like the others. No forced bravado, no violent outbursts. He was calculating. His hand rested near his waistband, not reaching for a weapon, but touching it absent-mindedly, like a man reminding himself it was there. Dana had interrogated enough men to recognize the signs. He was thinking about his odds, about his choices, about his future. That made him dangerous, but it also made him useful. Frank exhaled slowly, shifting just enough to glance around the cabin. He needed to know who else could fight when the time came. The young Marine in 22C, he was obvious. His fingers twitched every time one of the Reapers moved too close. It was taking everything in him not to act. The flight attendant near the galley, she was watching too. Young, nervous, but holding it together. That meant she was useful. Then there was the business suit type in row 15, older but fit. His jaw was tight, his breath controlled. Another one trying to play invisible while waiting for a chance to strike. That was at least 4 people. 4 wasn't enough. Not yet. Frank adjusted slightly, feeling the weight of the pocket knife still tucked into his sock. It wasn't much, but it was something. He had smuggled blades into places with tighter security than an airport. Old habits didn't die, even when the wars were over. If this was going to work, they needed a plan. They had 5 armed hijackers. They had limited weapons. They had 1 shot to get it right. Frank's fingers tapped the armrest. 1 tap, pause. 2 taps, a code. Across the aisle, Dana didn't react right away. Then her pinky flexed slightly. A response. They were ready. They just needed a spark. That spark came faster than expected. The cockpit door opened and Razor stepped back out. His face was different now, less controlled, more tense. His grip on the gun had tightened. Something had gone wrong. The co-pilot stumbled out behind him, clutching his ribs. Blood dripped through his fingers onto the cabin floor. A hushed gasp rippled through the passengers. Frank's stomach twisted. That wasn't a show of power. That was a mistake. A controlled hijacking didn't involve beating the crew unless something had gone off course. Razor raised his gun, silencing the murmurs. "Listen up," he said, his voice colder than before. "Your pilots are still alive, for now. That means you're still alive, but that only lasts as long as you follow orders. No demands, no ultimatums, just control." And the fact that he had been in the cockpit this long meant the situation up there was worse than he was letting on. Frank leaned back slightly. They had a chance. He caught Dana's eye again. She saw it too. Razor's patience was wearing thin. That meant he was making mistakes. And mistakes could be used against him. Frank exhaled, shifting his attention back to 26F, the weak link. The kid was sweating now. His hands were shaking, his knuckles white around the rifle's grip. His breathing was too fast, too shallow. Frank had seen men break before. He knew exactly what came next. When a man like that snapped, he either ran or got reckless. Either way, Frank was going to use it. But first, they needed to tip him over the edge. He glanced across the aisle at Dana. She had already picked her target too, 10B. She was about to make her move. Dana shifted in her seat just enough to catch 10B's attention. "You served," she whispered. His gaze flicked toward her. "You know how this ends." His jaw clenched. "Shut up." "You've seen it before," Dana continued, her voice low. "You know what happens when a plan starts falling apart, when the man in charge starts making mistakes." 10B didn't answer, but his grip on his waistband tightened. She had him. Now Frank had to play his part. He leaned slightly toward 26F, keeping his voice just as soft, just as measured. "You're not like them." The kid's eyes snapped to him. "You think they're gonna protect you," Frank continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Think they'll take care of you when this is over?" 26F's breathing hitched. Frank pushed harder. "I've seen your type before, young, scared. Thought you were signing up for something big, but you're in over your head, and now you're looking for a way out." 26F swallowed. His fingers twitched. That was it. That was the crack. Frank pressed one last time. "You want to get out of this alive?" he whispered. "Then don't be standing next to the wrong man when the fighting starts." The kid's hands trembled. He was right on the edge now, and that's when the plane shook. Turbulence, a rough pocket of air, sent a violent jolt through the cabin, rattling overhead bins, sending drinks spilling onto laps. Passengers gasped, gripping their seats, and that was the breaking point. 26F flinched hard, too hard. His finger twitched on the trigger, and the rifle went off. The shot tore through the overhead bin, blasting a hole through the plastic. Screams erupted. The Reapers snapped toward him. "What the hell?" Razor snarled, rounding on the kid. 26F's face was white as a sheet, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped the rifle. Frank saw it happen in slow motion. The kid's nerves were shot, and Razor saw it too. "Give me the gun," Razor ordered, stepping toward him. But 26F took a step back. "No, Razor raised his own gun. Frank didn't hesitate. He moved. His hand shot out, gripping the back of the kid's rifle, yanking it down just as Razor's gun went off. The shot missed, and then the cabin exploded into chaos. Dana was already moving, her elbow slamming into 10B's throat, sending him choking back against the seat. The Marine in 22C lunged, tackling 18D before the enforcer could react. The flight attendant swung a serving tray into 23A's head. Frank twisted the rifle from 26F's hands just as the kid went down, curling into himself. Razor snarled, spinning toward Frank, and Dana was already there. She slammed into Razor from the side, grabbing for his gun. The plane was no longer under their control. The resistance had begun. And Frank Dawson wasn't done fighting yet. The cabin was no longer silent. The moment the first shot went off, chaos took over. Flight 417, once locked in fear, had turned into a battlefield at 38,000 feet. Razor's men were scrambling, their controls slipping, and Frank Dawson knew what that meant. The only thing more dangerous than a man with a plan was a man whose plan was falling apart. Frank had seen it in war. He had seen it in the eyes of officers who sent men into ambushes they didn't expect, in the screams of soldiers when battle turned against them. And now he saw it in Razor. The sudden shift from confidence to fury, the realization that the plane was no longer his. Dana Reyes had moved first, slamming into Razor before he could take a clean shot at Frank. The force sent both of them crashing into the row of seats, passengers scrambling out of the way. Razor's gun fired once, twice, but the shots went wild, tearing through the overhead compartments instead of flesh. The air filled with the sharp tang of gunpowder and the panicked gasps of passengers. Someone screamed, but Frank wasn't paying attention to that. He had the rifle. That changed everything. But Razor wasn't the only problem. 18D, the enforcer, was still standing. The Marine in 22C had tackled him, but the man was too big, too strong, and too trained. He twisted violently, slamming an elbow into the Marine's ribs, and the young soldier went down hard between the rows of seats. 18D turned, eyes locking on Frank. Frank barely had time to react. The enforcer lunged, his bulk moving like a wrecking ball, and Frank felt the impact like a train hitting him head-on. He lost his grip on the rifle as he was slammed into the seats, the old bones in his back screaming in protest. Pain shot through his body. But pain wasn't unfamiliar. It was an old companion, something he had learned to work through. He gritted his teeth, forcing his arms up just in time to block 18D's next strike. The man was strong, brutally strong, a full-grown warrior in his prime. Frank was 92. The math wasn't in his favor. But Frank didn't fight with strength. He fought with experience. 18D reared back for another punch, aiming to crush his skull against the armrest, but Frank twisted his body at the last second, making the attack glance off his shoulder instead. The momentum sent 18D stumbling forward, and Frank used it. His hands shot up, grabbing the man's face, his thumbs pressing hard into his eyes. The enforcer roared in pain, jerking back, and Frank followed through. He wasn't fast, but he was smart. He used the moment of disorientation to drive his knee into the side of 18D's leg, right where the nerves were weakest. The big man staggered, his body tilting just enough. And then the Marine was back. With a guttural yell, the young soldier lunged again, this time grabbing 18D around the neck. He didn't try to take him down with brute force. Instead, he went for something more effective, a rear naked choke. Frank saw it instantly. It was a good hold, not perfect, but good enough. 18D struggled, thrashing, but the Marine held firm, his grip tightening like a vice. The enforcer's face turned red, then purple. He clawed at the Marine's arms, trying to break free, but he was losing too much oxygen too fast, and then he went still. The Marine let go, panting, watching as 18D slumped forward into the aisle, unconscious. Frank exhaled, one down. But there wasn't time to celebrate. Razor was still fighting. Dana was holding her own, but barely. The leader of the Reapers was fast, his movements sharp and efficient. She had managed to lock his gun arm, keeping him from aiming properly, but Razor was using his weight against her, slamming her into the seats, trying to break her grip. She wouldn't last much longer. Frank's mind moved on instinct. The rifle was gone, lost in the scuffle. His pocket knife was still in his sock, but there wasn't time to reach for it. He needed something else. His eyes scanned the cabin. Passengers were still cowering, some holding onto their loved ones, some crying. But one man wasn't cowering. 10B, the soldier, the Reaper who wasn't sure which side he was really on. Frank didn't hesitate. He locked eyes with him, forcing all the authority he had left into his voice. "You want to survive this?" Frank said. "Then make a damn choice." For a second, 10B just stared at him. Then something shifted. He moved. Not toward Frank, toward Razor. Dana had just managed to throw Razor off her, sending him staggering back a few steps, but she was already winded, bruises forming on her arms where he had grabbed her. She wasn't ready for the next attack, but 10B was. He lunged, grabbing Razor's arm from behind, twisting it at an unnatural angle. Razor roared in pain, jerking forward, trying to throw him off. "Don't be stupid, man," Razor snarled. "You turn on me, you're dead." 10B didn't answer, but his grip tightened. Frank didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his hand snapping down toward his boot, yanking out his pocket knife in one smooth motion. It wasn't big, but it was enough. Razor was still trying to shake off 10B when Frank drove the knife into his thigh. The scream was animalistic, raw and full of rage. Razor jerked backward, his gun falling from his grip. Dana was already there. She caught it in midair, flipped it in her hands, and pressed the barrel against Razor's forehead. The entire cabin went silent. Passengers stared. The Reapers, who were still standing, 23A and the now broken 26F, froze, their eyes wide with disbelief. Razor's breathing was ragged, his face contorted in fury. "End it!" he spat. Dana's finger hovered over the trigger. For a moment Frank thought she would do it, but she didn't. Instead, she stepped back. "No," she said. "I'd rather watch you rot." Then she shifted the gun slightly and slammed the butt of it against Razor's skull. He went down, hard. The cabin was completely still now. Frank turned to 10B. The former Reaper exhaled, staring at Razor's crumpled body. "Well," he muttered, "guess I made my choice." Frank nodded. "Guess you did." Dana straightened, looking around at the terrified passengers. Then she turned to Frank. "We're not done," she said. Frank sighed. His ribs ached, his body was screaming at him, but she was right. The plane was still in the air, the pilots were still compromised, and this wasn't over yet. He adjusted his grip on the knife. "Then let's finish it." The cabin was deathly quiet, except for the sound of labored breathing and the occasional stifled sob. The fight had lasted minutes, but to the terrified passengers it had felt like an eternity. Razor lay unconscious at Dana's feet, his face half hidden in a pool of his own blood. 18D was still out cold from the Marine's chokehold. His massive form slumped between the seats. The weak link 26F had collapsed into the fetal position, his rifle discarded on the floor, trembling hands covering his head. Frank Dawson stood motionless, the handle of his pocket knife slick with blood. His heart pounded in his chest, his muscles burning, but his mind was sharper than it had been in years. He scanned the cabin, checking for threats. The fight was over, but the war wasn't won yet. They still had two hijackers standing, 10B and 23A. 10B had already made his choice. He stood stiffly, his gaze locked on Razor's crumpled body, his fingers twitching slightly at his sides. Frank could see it in his face, doubt, regret, but most importantly, finality. There was no turning back for him now, but 23A was a different story. He had backed up against the bulkhead near the emergency exit, eyes darting wildly between Dana's gun and the unconscious bodies of his crew. His own weapon was still drawn, shaking slightly in his hands. He was cornered, and cornered men were dangerous. Frank took a slow step forward. "Son, it's over." His voice was steady, but not unkind. "Put the gun down." 23A's grip tightened. "Not a chance, old man." His breathing was erratic, his pupils dilated. He was panicking, his mind running in a dozen directions at once, looking for a way out. Dana adjusted her stance, keeping the gun aimed at his chest. "Don't be stupid. You saw what just happened. Your boss is down. Your enforcer is down. The kid over there is probably crying for his mother. You're the last one standing." 23A's jaw clenched. He wasn't ready to give up yet. Frank knew that feeling, the desperation, the refusal to surrender, the instinct to go down swinging, even when swinging meant certain death. He had seen it in enemy soldiers, in young men barely out of their teens who clung to their weapons like lifelines, even when their units had been obliterated. He needed to break that instinct. He took another step closer, ignoring the ache in his ribs, the stiffness in his legs. "You have a killer man, son?" 23A flinched slightly, the question catching him off guard. "What?" Frank's voice was quiet, but heavy. "I have. Too many to count. Some I had to, some I didn't. And I promise you, if you pull that trigger right now, that's the moment that'll haunt you for the rest of your life. You think you're a tough guy? Think you're ready to carry that weight?" 23A's breath hitched, just for a second. Frank saw it, the crack. "You put that gun down," Frank continued, stepping even closer, "and you still have a life after this. You still get to walk away. The younger man's hands trembled. His knuckles were white around the grip of his gun. His mind was warring with itself, pride against survival, rage against reason. Then his body sagged slightly, like all the fight had drained out of him at once. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered the gun. A collective exhale rippled through the cabin. Dana moved fast, stepping forward and kicking the weapon away before snatching a pair of zip ties from a fallen reaper and securing his wrists. "Smart choice," she muttered. Frank turned to 10B. "You gonna give us trouble?" 10B shook his head. "I already made my choice." He stepped away from the others, raising his hands slightly to show he wasn't a threat. Frank nodded. He believed him, but they weren't safe yet. Dana turned to the cockpit, her expression grim. "What the hell did they do to the pilots?" Frank's stomach twisted. Razor had come out of that cockpit pissed. That meant something had gone wrong. "Stay here," Dana told him. "Keep an eye on these bastards. I'll check it out." Frank frowned. "You should take someone with you." Dana hesitated, then nodded. The Marine. 22C perked up, shaking off the last of his adrenaline rush. He stepped forward, rolling his shoulders. "I got you." She nodded and moved toward the cockpit, the Marine close behind. Frank turned back to the rest of the passengers. "Everyone listen up," he said, his voice firm but calm. "We're still in the air, which means we're still in danger. But we're in control now. I need everyone to stay in their seats and stay calm." A woman in the front row wiped tears from her face. "Are they going to kill us?" Frank shook his head. "No, ma'am. We're going to land this plane, and we're all going to walk off it." He wasn't sure if that was true, but he needed them to believe it. Minutes passed. The tension in the cabin was still thick, but there was a shift. Fear had loosened its grip slightly, replaced by something else, hope. Then Dana's voice crackled through the cabin. "Frank," she called from the cockpit, "we've got a problem." Frank's gut tightened. He turned, moving toward the front of the plane. When he stepped inside the cockpit, he immediately saw the problem. The pilot was slumped over the controls, unconscious. Blood trickled from a gash on his temple, staining the front of his uniform. The co-pilot was awake, barely, but his face was swollen, his left eye nearly shut from a vicious hit. His breathing was ragged, and he looked up at Dana with glazed eyes. He took the radio," the co-pilot rasped. Frank frowned. "What?" Dana gestured to the dashboard. "Razor ripped out the damn radio before he came out." Frank's stomach dropped. "You're telling me we have no way to communicate with the ground?" The co-pilot groaned, shifting slightly. "There's a backup, but it's weak." Dana turned back to Frank. "This isn't just a hijacking. They weren't planning to negotiate. They weren't planning to land." Frank exhaled slowly. "They were going to crash the damn plane." Silence. The Marine stiffened. "We need to get this bird on the ground. Fast." Frank turned back to the co-pilot. "Can you fly?" The man grimaced, trying to sit up straighter. I don't know. I feel..." His head lolled slightly. Dana caught his shoulder. "Stay with me, buddy. We need you." The co-pilot gritted his teeth. "If you can stabilize me, I can try." Frank turned back toward the cabin. "Someone find a doctor." A woman raised her hand. "I'm a nurse." Frank motioned her forward. "You're up." Dana turned to Frank. "We need to make a call." "We don't have a radio." She shook her head. "Not the radio. The in-flight phone." Frank blinked. She pointed to the panel near the cockpit door. "It's satellite-based. It's meant for emergencies." Frank let out a breath. "Then let's make a damn call." Dana moved fast, grabbing the receiver and punching in a direct line to air traffic control. The seconds stretched long. Then a voice crackled through. "This is air traffic control. Flight 4117. Do you read?" Dana exhaled. "This is LAPD Detective Dana Reyes. We have a hijacked aircraft, and we need immediate emergency landing clearance." There was a pause, then, "Understood, Detective. We're bringing you in." Frank exhaled. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time since the nightmare began, they had a chance, and sometimes A chance was all you needed. The satellite phone crackled with static, and then a voice, calm but urgent, filled the cockpit. "This is Captain Reynolds with air traffic control. Who am I speaking to?" Dana Reyes gripped the receiver tightly, glancing at the injured co-pilot before answering. "LAPD Detective Dana Reyes. We have a critical situation aboard Flight 417. The hijackers have been subdued, but our pilots are incapacitated. We need immediate emergency landing clearance." A brief silence. Then Reynolds' voice returned, sharper now. "Copy that, Detective. What's the status of the aircraft?" Dana looked at the co-pilot, who was struggling to sit upright, his fingers weakly gripping the edge of the instrument panel. His breath was shallow, his skin pale. He wasn't going to last much longer. "The pilot is unconscious. The co-pilot is in rough shape, but says he can attempt to fly with assistance." She hesitated. "How much fuel do we have left?" The co-pilot blinked blearily at the gauges, then muttered, "Less than an hour. We can't make it to JFK. We need to land. Soon." Reynolds responded immediately. "Understood. We're rerouting you to Denver International. You'll be met by emergency crews upon arrival. Can the co-pilot maintain altitude and approach?" Dana turned to him. "Can you do this?" He inhaled sharply, trying to gather himself. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "If you help me with controls, I can try." Dana relayed the message. "We'll get him there. What do you need from us?" Reynolds' voice remained steady, professional. "We're sending real-time weather updates and clearance codes to your cockpit. Keep us steady at your current altitude, reduce speed, and prepare for descent. We'll talk you through every step." Frank Dawson listened to the exchange, standing just behind Dana, his weathered hands resting against the seat. His mind was still racing. The pilots were out of commission, but the immediate danger hadn't passed yet, because Razor was still breathing. And Frank knew that a man like him wouldn't stay down forever. He turned to Dana, lowering his voice. "We've still got a problem." Dana frowned, covering the receiver. "What?" Frank motioned toward the cabin. "We might have control now, but we're one bad decision away from losing it again. Razor's men are restrained, but they're not neutralized. If one of them makes a move, or if Razor wakes up—" He trailed off, letting the words hang. Dana understood immediately. The fight wasn't finished. Not yet. She sighed. "I'll handle the passengers. You handle the prisoners." Frank nodded. His ribs ached. His body protested every step, but he moved back into the main cabin anyway. The passengers were still visibly shaken. Some were whispering among themselves. Others were frozen in shock, clinging to their seats. A mother held her child tightly, whispering reassurances that sounded more like prayers. An older man in a business suit rubbed his temples, muttering about lawsuits. But most of them were watching him, waiting for him to tell them what happened next. He turned toward the group of subdued hijackers. 26F, the weak link, was still curled into himself, rocking slightly. 23A sat stiffly, wrists bound in zip ties, staring at the floor. And then there was 10B, the defector. Frank crouched beside Razor's unconscious body, feeling for a pulse. It was still strong. The bastard wasn't done yet. He exhaled sharply, then turned to 10B. "How long before he wakes up?" 10B hesitated. He had thrown away his loyalty, and now he was in a strange limbo. No longer a Reaper, but not yet trusted. Depends. A couple minutes, maybe less. Frank clenched his jaw. "Then we don't have time." He grabbed a second set of zip ties from the overhead compartment and tightened them around Razor's ankles, binding them to the seat frame. It wasn't foolproof, but at least it would slow him down when he woke up. Dana reappeared from the cockpit, sliding her gun back into her waistband. "We're clear to land in Denver. They're prepping emergency crews now." Frank nodded. "Good, but we're not clear yet." He motioned toward the passengers, lowering his voice. "They're scared. And scared people do stupid things." Dana exhaled, rubbing her forehead. "You want me to talk to them?" Frank shook his head. "You handle the cockpit. I'll keep the people in line." She hesitated, then nodded. "All right, just don't have a heart attack while you're at it." Frank smirked. "Not my first war, Reyes." She disappeared back into the cockpit, leaving Frank alone with 70 panicked passengers. He took a deep breath, then raised his voice. "All right, listen up." The murmuring stopped. Every pair of eyes turned toward him. "We're landing this plane in Denver," he said. "The hijackers are down, but we're not safe yet. I need everyone to stay calm. Stay in your seats and do exactly as we say. No heroics, no sudden movements. We've already won this fight. Now we just have to finish it." A man in the back stood up, shaking his head. "Why aren't we tying them all up? What if they try something?" Frank locked eyes with him. "We have them under control. We're keeping watch. If anyone makes a move, we'll handle it." The man swallowed, hesitating, then he slowly sat back down. Frank turned his attention to the hijackers. He crouched in front of 23A. "You made the right call, surrendering," he said. "That means when we land, you're still breathing. Don't do anything to change that." 23A nodded stiffly. Frank shifted his gaze to 26F, who was still trembling. The kid looked like he was about to throw up. "You," Frank said, softer now. "Look at me." 26F hesitated, then lifted his head slightly. "You're done," Frank told him. "This isn't your fight anymore. Keep your head down, stay quiet, and when we land, you'll get to walk away from this." The kid blinked rapidly, his breath coming in shallow bursts. He looked like he wanted to cry. Frank patted his shoulder once, then stood. He turned back to the rest of the cabin. "This plane's coming down in less than 30 minutes. We hold the line until then." Silence. Then slowly, passengers started nodding. Frank exhaled. Now, all they had to do was land the damn thing. He moved back toward the cockpit, stepping inside to find Dana in the co-pilot's seat, her hands hovering near the controls. The co-pilot was awake but clearly fading, sweat dripping down his brow as he tried to focus on the instruments. Dana glanced at Frank. "We've got a hell of a crosswind coming in on approach. The co-pilot can guide us, but I might have to take the stick." Frank raised an eyebrow. "You know how to fly?" Dana gave a small, humorless laugh. "Enough to keep us from crashing, I hope." The co-pilot's voice was weak. "Autopilot is engaged, but manual override will be needed on descent." Frank looked out the windshield. The distant lights of Denver International Airport were coming into view. They were almost there. Almost. But Frank knew better than anyone. The most dangerous part of a mission is always the end. He tightened his grip on the back of Dana's seat. "Let's bring this bird down." The descent had begun. The hum of the engines shifted as Flight 417 banked slightly, aligning itself with the distant runway lights of Denver International Airport. The once dark horizon was now speckled with civilization, a promise of safety that felt agonizingly out of reach. But Frank Dawson knew better than to feel relief too soon. The most dangerous part of any mission wasn't the beginning. It wasn't even the fight itself. It was the part where you thought you'd won. He gripped the back of Dana Reyes's seat, his knuckles white. The cockpit was tight, filled with blinking lights and digital readouts that might as well have been in another language to him. The injured co-pilot was barely conscious, his breathing ragged. His fingers twitched weakly over the controls. But it was clear to Frank that he wasn't going to land this plane. Not alone. Dana was already leaning into the panel, eyes darting between dials and screens, listening intently as air traffic control fed them instructions. She wasn't a pilot. That much was obvious, but she was something almost as good. An officer used to being thrown into situations she wasn't prepared for and figuring them out on the fly. "Descending to 10,000 feet, Dana muttered, adjusting the controls. The plane responded, the cabin tilting forward slightly. Flaps adjusting, speed reduced. So far, so good. Frank glanced through the windshield. The city was growing larger, the airport's runways now visible. The flashing blue and white lights of emergency vehicles lined the tarmac. They were expecting them. Then the intercom crackled. "This is Captain Reynolds from Air Traffic Control. You're approaching the final leg of descent. Confirm status of hijackers." Dana pressed the button on the radio. "Razor and his crew are down. 3 restrained, 2 unconscious. Passengers secure. We've regained control of the plane." A pause. Then Reynolds' voice returned, hesitant. "Copy that, Flight 417. But there's something you need to know. Frank's gut twisted. There's a secondary threat on board. The word sent a cold wave through his spine. Dana stiffened. Say again. Reynolds's voice was measured, but urgent. We intercepted a communication. Razor's team wasn't acting alone. There's an unknown accomplice on board, possibly armed. Frank felt the blood drain from his face. Another one. It wasn't over. Dana leaned back from the radio, her hands tightening on the controls. Did they say who? Negative, Reynolds replied. Just that the hijacking wasn't meant to end here. There's another operative, and they may have been waiting for you to make your move before acting. Frank's fingers twitched toward his pocket knife. It was all he had left as a weapon, but it didn't matter. He had fought entire wars with less. He turned toward the cockpit door, his mind already racing. Then we need to find them before they do something stupid. Dana hesitated, her grip firm on the controls. I can't leave the cockpit, Frank nodded. Then I'll handle it. Dana's eyes met his, and for the first time since this had started, he saw something flicker across her face. Not doubt, not fear, but respect. She gave him a single nod. Be careful, old man. Frank pushed open the cockpit door and stepped into the cabin. It had settled into an eerie stillness. The passengers were tense, waiting, clinging to the fragile hope that they were close to the end. But Frank knew better. There was still a snake in the grass. He moved carefully, his old bones aching with every step. His eyes swept over the cabin, scanning each face, each shift in posture. Most of the passengers avoided his gaze, but he wasn't looking for fear. He was looking for calm, because a trained operative wouldn't be panicked. They wouldn't be trembling. They would be waiting. His first thought was 10B, the Reaper who had turned. Could he be playing both sides? Was his surrender an act? But Frank dismissed the idea almost immediately. 10B had made his choice back in the fight. That kind of choice wasn't reversible. Then there was 23A. But the kid was too rattled, too defeated. The weak link 26F was still visibly shaken, mumbling to himself. Who the hell was it? Then he saw the man in the business suit, row 15, the one who had questioned them earlier, who had demanded they tie up the hijackers. Something about him felt off. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't relieved. He was too still. Frank slowed his approach, watching, reading him, the way his hands were positioned, the slight tension in his shoulders. Then the man turned, just slightly, and Frank caught a glimpse of something metallic tucked beneath his jacket, a weapon. And in that instant, Frank knew this was him, the accomplice, the real threat. Frank moved. His body was old, but instinct was timeless. He lunged, one arm reaching for the man's gun, the other clamping down on his wrist before he could pull it free. The businessman's eyes widened in shock as Frank yanked him into the aisle. A struggle erupted, violent and fast. The passengers screamed as the two men crashed into the rows of seats, limbs tangled, fists swinging. Frank's grip was strong, but the man was younger, faster. He twisted, breaking free just enough to pull the gun from his jacket. A black Glock. Frank barely had time to react before the barrel was shoved against his ribs. Then bang! The shot echoed through the cabin. Frank stumbled backward, bracing himself for pain, but there was none, because the bullet never hit him. The man gasped sharply, his body jerking, then slumping forward. Frank caught him as he collapsed, his gun falling from limp fingers, and behind him stood 10B. A smoking pistol in his hand. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then 10B exhaled, shaking his head. You were right, old man. I made my choice. Frank let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The accomplice was down. It was over. Finally, it was over. The passengers erupted into hushed sobs and whispers of relief. Frank turned to 10B, nodding. Good shot. 10B holstered the pistol. Figured I owed you one. The intercom crackled again. Dana's voice filled the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, prepare for landing. Frank stepped toward the cockpit, looking out the windshield. The runway was right there, growing larger as the plane descended. After everything, after the fight, the blood, the chaos, they were going home. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. He had lived through war, through loss, through battles where the odds were never in his favor. And yet, even after all these years, the old soldier had one more fight left in him. The wheels hit the tarmac with a jolt. The engines roared, slowing the aircraft as it sped down the runway. Flight 417 had survived. They had survived. And as Frank sat back, his body aching but his heart steady, he knew one thing for sure. War never really leaves a man. But sometimes, just sometimes, it lets him win. The wheels screamed against the tarmac as Flight 417 skidded to a stop on the Denver International runway. The cabin jolted forward, passengers lurching against their seatbelts as the engines howled in protest. For a few long seconds, no one spoke. No one moved. Then, like a breaking dam, a wave of gasps, sobs, and shuddering breaths filled the air. They had made it. Frank Dawson exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in his bones begin to unravel. His old hands trembled against the seat in front of him. His entire body ached from the fight, but he ignored it. Pain was just a reminder that he was still here. The seatbelt sign blinked off, but no one unbuckled. They were still frozen in place, waiting, unsure if the nightmare was really over. Then the intercom crackled. Dana Reyes's voice filled the cabin. "This is Detective Reyes. Remain seated. Emergency teams are approaching the aircraft. Do not move until instructed." Frank shifted his gaze toward the front of the plane. The cockpit door was still open, revealing Dana slumped in the co-pilot's seat, her fingers wrapped around the armrest in a white-knuckled grip. The co-pilot, barely conscious, had somehow managed to guide them to safety, but it was Dana who had kept them steady, who had made sure they landed in one piece. She turned her head slightly, locking eyes with Frank. No words were spoken, but he knew what she was saying. "We did it." He gave her the smallest nod. "Yeah, kid, we did." Outside, flashing red and blue lights strobed against the windows. Emergency vehicles swarmed the tarmac, police cruisers, ambulances, fire trucks, their sirens muted but urgent. This was no ordinary landing. This was a battlefield extraction. Frank pushed himself up, his ribs screaming in protest. He ignored it. There was still one thing left to do. He turned his attention back to the hijackers. Razor was awake now, his face twisted in fury and pain. Blood ran down the side of his head from where Dana had pistol-whipped him, his hands and ankles bound to the seat frame with industrial-strength zip ties. He wasn't struggling anymore. He wasn't screaming or barking orders. He was just watching. Frank knew that look. Frank. It wasn't fear. It wasn't defeat. It was something worse. It was certainty. Frank took a slow step forward, ignoring the murmurs of the passengers, ignoring the way 10B tensed beside him, ready to intervene if needed. He crouched down beside Razor, his voice low and steady. "You already knew you were going to lose this fight, didn't you?" Razor smirked, a thin trickle of blood running over his lips. "It was never about this plane." A chill ran down Frank's spine. "Then what the hell was it about?" Razor tilted his head, his grin widening despite the pain. "You're an old man, Dawson, a soldier. You know how this works. You don't win wars by just taking one city. You take the whole damn country." Frank's gut tightened. He glanced toward Dana, who had stepped into the aisle, gun still raised. "What does that mean?" she demanded. Razor let out a rough chuckle, leaning his head back against the seat. "You think we were just some gang looking for a payday? You think this was just some hijacking gone wrong?" He spat blood onto the floor, his smile never fading. "This was a test run." Silence. Frank's fingers twitched. His grip tightened on the armrest. Dana stepped closer. "A test run? For what?" Razor sighed, like a man disappointed that no one was keeping up. "The next one." Dana's breath hitched. "There's another plane." Razor's grin stretched wider. "You're quick, detective, but not quick enough." Frank's pulse pounded in his ears. His mind was already racing through the possibilities. The radio had been destroyed. They had only been able to make contact because of the in-flight satellite phone. But what if there was another flight? One that hadn't been able to call for help? Dana turned toward the front of the plane, jabbing the intercom button. "Reynolds, do you copy?" A burst of static. Then the air traffic controller's voice came through, strained and urgent. "Reyes, what's going on up there?" "There's another plane," Dana said, her voice sharp. "Razor just confirmed it. We need to know, have there been any other hijacking attempts tonight?" A pause. Then Reynolds' voice returned, tighter. "Stand by." The next 10 seconds stretched into eternity. Then, oh hell, Frank's stomach sank. "We lost contact with an international flight coming in from Berlin," Reynolds said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Flight 762, last transmission was 20 minutes ago. Since then, nothing. Silence." Frank exchanged a look with Dana. 20 minutes ago, they had still been fighting for control of this plane. While they had been struggling to survive, another plane was already in the hands of someone worse. Dana turned back to Razor, her eyes burning. "Who's on that flight?" Razor chuckled again, but there was no humor in it. Just certainty. "Not my problem anymore." Dana's jaw clenched. She stepped forward, pressing the barrel of the gun against his forehead. "Answer me," Razor laughed. It was infuriating. It was wrong. Frank had seen men laugh in the face of death before, but this wasn't bravado. This wasn't a desperate attempt at control. Razor wasn't afraid, because whatever came next was bigger than him. "Go ahead," he said. "Shoot me. You think it makes a difference?" He leaned forward as far as the zip ties would allow, his eyes locked on hers. "That plane is already gone." Dana's finger twitched on the trigger. Frank grabbed her wrist. "Reyes." She didn't lower the gun. Her jaw was tight, her breath coming in shallow, furious bursts. "He's playing you," Frank murmured. "Don't give him what he wants." Dana's grip shook. Then after a moment she pulled back. She turned to Reynolds. "We need confirmation. Where is Flight 762? Another pause. Then, Jesus Christ. The cockpit speakers crackled. "The plane veered off course 20 minutes ago. They should have landed at JFK by now, but..." Reynolds' voice broke slightly. "They're not on radar anymore." Dana's hands curled into fists. Frank inhaled sharply. He turned back to Razor. "What's on that plane?" Razor's smile didn't falter, but his eyes burned. "You'll find out soon enough." Frank's blood ran cold. The fight for Flight 417 was over, but the war had just begun. Outside, the emergency doors burst open as SWAT teams swarmed the aircraft. Passengers were ushered out. Razor and his men were yanked from their seats, dragged down the aisle. But none of it mattered. Not really, because another plane was missing. And whatever was happening next was already in motion. Frank turned toward Dana. She was still gripping the gun. Her hands were still shaking. Her eyes met his. "We're not done," she whispered. Frank exhaled, his muscles aching, his ribs screaming. But she was right. They weren't done. Not even close. Frank Dawson sat on the edge of a stretcher, his old bones aching, his breathing steady but heavy. Paramedics moved through the crowd of passengers, assessing injuries, distributing blankets, whispering reassurances that felt hollow against the weight of what they had just endured. The Denver tarmac was chaos, flashing red and blue lights painting the scene in a surreal glow. SWAT officers swarmed the aircraft, securing the remaining Black Reapers, zip ties cinched tight around their wrists. Razor was already in custody, but he wasn't struggling, because Razor knew what Frank knew. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Dana Reyes stood a few feet away, her phone pressed to her ear, her expression locked in something between anger and exhaustion. Her other hand clenched the waistband of her cargo pants, knuckles white, muscles tense. She was listening, absorbing information, planning. Frank already knew what she was hearing. Another plane. Another hijacking, another war, already underway. She ended the call, exhaling through her nose before turning to Frank. "They still can't find Flight 762. Last transmission was mid-Atlantic, then it just disappeared." Frank frowned. "A commercial airliner doesn't just disappear." Dana shook her head. "I know. ATC thinks they cut their transponder, but that's not the part that's making everyone panic." Frank waited. Dana's jaw clenched. That plane wasn't just full of passengers. It was carrying an international diplomat, high profile, the kind of person that, if they go missing, Governments start calling in the military. Frank let out a slow breath. So that's the play. Dana nodded. They didn't just want hostages. They wanted a bargaining chip big enough to make the whole world pay attention. Frank ran a hand through his graying hair, his mind already shifting gears. He had spent decades dismantling threats like this, understanding the men who orchestrated them. This wasn't about money, not anymore. This was about power. He glanced toward the SWAT officers leading Razor away. He knew this was coming. He wanted us to think we won, but we were never meant to stop this. Dana followed his gaze. Razor walked like a man who had already accepted his fate. His lips curled in a smirk as he passed them. "Enjoy your victory, old man." His voice was low, taunting. "Because you just played your part perfectly." Frank's stomach tightened. What the hell does that mean? Razor only chuckled as he was shoved into the back of a waiting armored vehicle. Dana exhaled sharply, turning back to Frank. "We don't have time for his games. We need to focus on Flight 762. Frank nodded. "Then let's figure out where the hell they took it." Dana pulled out her phone again, already dialing. Frank knew who she was calling. Someone high up, someone who had the kind of access they needed. He tuned out the conversation, his eyes scanning the scene. Then something caught his attention. A man, standing too still, too calm among the chaos. He wasn't a paramedic, wasn't a police officer. He was dressed like an airport official, but his posture was all wrong. Shoulders squared, feet braced, head moving in careful measured sweeps, trained. Frank's instincts screamed at him. The man turned slightly, and for a brief second Frank saw it. A bulge beneath his jacket. A gun. His body moved before his mind fully caught up. He pushed off the stretcher, ignoring the stiffness in his joints, closing the distance in 5 quick strides. The man saw him at the last second. His hand darted toward his jacket. Frank grabbed his wrist, twisting it sharply. The man grunted in pain, but he didn't hesitate. He went for a knife instead, his free hand reaching toward his belt. Frank moved faster. A sharp elbow to the ribs, a twist of the wrist. A calculated shove. The man staggered backward, his balance thrown. Just enough for Frank to slam him face first against a police cruiser. Dana was there a second later, gun drawn. "Don't move!" the man growled, struggling, but Frank had years of experience and a bad temper keeping him locked in place. A SWAT officer ran over, slapping cuffs around his wrists. "Who the hell is this?" Frank leaned in close, his voice low and dangerous. "That's what we're about to find out." Dana stepped forward, gripping the man's chin, forcing him to look up. "You're not a hijacker. You weren't on the plane. So tell me, who the hell are you working for?" The man's lips curled into something almost smug. "You'll see soon enough." Frank exchanged a look with Dana. They had heard those words before, and they never meant anything good. A phone buzzed. Dana's. She answered immediately. "Reyes?" Silence. Then her expression changed. Frank knew that look. Bad news. She swallowed hard. "When?" More silence. Then, "Where?" Frank felt his pulse quicken. "What is it?" Dana lowered the phone slowly. "Flight 762 just resurfaced." Frank exhaled sharply. "Where?" Dana's voice was quiet. "It just landed." Frank's stomach dropped. "Landed? Where?" Dana's hands trembled slightly as she read the location off her screen. A military airstrip, unregistered, remote, not controlled by the United States. Frank clenched his jaw. "Then we've got a real problem." Dana nodded. Because they both knew. The hijackers hadn't just taken another plane. They had delivered it. And whatever was on board Flight 762, the world wasn't ready for it. The black SUV tore through the winding desert road, kicking up clouds of dust beneath its tires. Inside, Frank Dawson sat in the back seat, gripping the handle above the door, his knuckles tight. The vehicle rocked over uneven terrain, but he barely noticed. His mind was locked on one thing. Flight 762 had landed. Dana Reyes was in the passenger seat. Phone pressed to her ear, listening to the latest intel from her contact in Washington. Her face was stone, but Frank could see the tension in her jaw. They weren't heading into a negotiation. This wasn't an extraction. This was a war zone. "We have satellite confirmation," Dana said finally, lowering the phone. "Flight 762 is on the ground at a remote airstrip outside of Juarez, Mexico. No radio contact, no distress calls, just landed and went silent." Frank exhaled slowly. "They planned this from the start," Dana nodded. "This wasn't about hijacking planes. This was about delivering something." Frank didn't like the sound of that. Neither did 10B, sitting beside him. The former Black Reaper, now an uneasy ally, adjusted the rifle in his lap, glancing between them. "You think this is a hostage thing? Or something worse?" Frank looked out the window, the desert stretching endlessly in every direction. He didn't answer because he already knew. It was worse. Ahead of them, 2 more SUVs rumbled over the terrain, each filled with SWAT operators, DEA agents, and ex-military personnel who had been assembled within hours. This wasn't a typical operation. This was off the books. No bureaucratic red tape, no formal orders, just a mission to stop whatever the hell was happening before it went global. A voice crackled through Dana's earpiece. "Eyes on the airstrip. We're 2 clicks out. No movement on the tarmac." Frank sat forward. "That's not a good sign." Dana muttered a curse under her breath. "No welcoming party means they're inside the damn plane." Frank tightened his grip on his rifle. "Then we're going in." The convoy slowed as they approached the airstrip. The runway stretched ahead, cracked from years of disrepair, barely maintained. And there, sitting in the center like a predator waiting in the dark, was Flight 762. The Boeing 777 loomed like a beast against the backdrop of the desert sky. Its windows were dark, its fuselage marked with fresh streaks of dirt from an unplanned landing. But it was silent. No movement, no sign of life, which meant only one thing. They were waiting. Dana's radio crackled again. No heat signatures outside the aircraft. All hostiles presumed inside. Frank checked his weapon. "Then let's flush them out." The SUVs skidded to a stop near the edge of the runway. Doors slammed open, boots hit the ground, and the team moved fast. Dana took point, rifle up, moving with sharp precision. Frank followed, his old joints protesting but his mind clear as ever. 10B moved behind them, keeping close, his weapon trained on the aircraft's doors. "Breaching formation," Dana ordered, signaling to the team. 2 SWAT officers split off toward the side entrance of the plane. Another team moved toward the cargo hold. If anyone was inside, they weren't going to have a way out. Frank's eyes locked onto the main cabin door. It was open, just slightly, like an invitation. Frank exchanged a glance with Dana. "They want us to come in." Dana didn't hesitate. "Then we do." The team moved in, fast and silent. Frank was the second one up the boarding stairs, his rifle raised as they entered the dimly lit cabin. The first thing he noticed was the smell. Sweat, blood, and something else. Something rotting. Bodies. Frank's gut twisted as his eyes adjusted. Rows of passengers, still buckled into their seats, their faces slack, lifeless. Dana moved forward, pressing 2 fingers to the neck of a woman in the front row. Then she shook her head. Dead. Frank clenched his jaw. He had seen death before. Too much of it. But this wasn't just murder. This was a statement, and then a whisper, a shuffle from the back of the plane. The team froze, weapons raised, Frank's pulse steady. Then movement. A figure stepped into the aisle. Frank's breath caught. It was a man. No, what was left of one. His skin was pale, slick with sweat. His pupils were blown wide, his body twitching unnaturally. His hands shook violently, his breath ragged and uneven. Dana took a slow step forward, gun locked on him. "Sir, put your hands where I can see them." The man didn't respond. He twitched again. Frank's instincts screamed at him. Something was wrong. Then the man lurched forward fast. Dana fired one shot, center mass. He didn't fall. Instead, he kept coming. Frank reacted. 2 shots, both to the chest. He still didn't go down. The team opened fire. The man jerked backward, his body absorbing 6 rounds, but he kept moving. His face twisted into something inhuman. Then, boom, a final shot, straight to the head. He collapsed. Silence. Frank's heart pounded against his ribs. His hands gripped his rifle so tightly his knuckles turned white. "What the hell was that?" Dana whispered. Then a sound, a low, gurgling breath. Gurgling. Frank turned toward the rows of passengers, the dead ones, except now they weren't all dead. A woman's head snapped toward him. Her pupils were blown wide, her lips parting as a ragged breath escaped her throat. Then another and another. Frank stepped back. "They're not dead." The woman moved. Her fingers flexed, her head twisting at an unnatural angle, her body convulsing violently. Dana's breath hitched. Oh, hell. The passengers began to rise. Not alive, not dead. Something in between. Frank's stomach clenched. This wasn't a hijacking, this was a delivery. And Flight 762 was the package. The realization hit him like a bullet. They had just walked into the real attack, and now it was too late to walk out. The air inside Flight 762 was thick with death, but the dead weren't staying dead. Frank Dawson had seen plenty of bodies in his life, too many to count, but never like this. Never ones that twitched back to life, their heads jerking unnaturally, their pupils wide and glassy, like they weren't seeing the world the way normal people did. His hands tightened around his rifle, the stock pressing firm against his shoulder as the first of them started to move. Dana Reyes was frozen for only a second before she snapped into action. "Everyone, back now!" Her voice cut through the cabin, sharp, commanding, but it didn't matter. The things that had once been passengers weren't stopping. They convulsed, their bodies sluggish at first, then stronger, their hands clawing at the armrests as they pushed themselves to stand. Their heads twitched toward the living, like predators scenting fresh prey. One of the SWAT officers panicked and fired a shot into the nearest one. A middle-aged man in a business suit, whose tie was still neatly knotted at his throat. The round hit center mass, knocking him back into his seat, but it didn't stop him. The thing barely reacted. Then it lunged, its mouth stretched open in a silent scream, teeth snapping as it moved faster than it should have, grabbing the officer by the vest, dragging him forward. Frank didn't hesitate. He aimed higher, a clean shot to the head, one bullet. The body crumpled instantly, dead for real this time. Dana whipped around, her gun raised. "Headshots only!" It was too late. The cabin erupted into chaos. The dead, or whatever the hell they were now, surged forward, their bodies jerking unnaturally, their movements eerily fast, like their nervous systems were working on overdrive. They didn't scream. They didn't speak. Just mindless, aggressive, relentless motion. Frank didn't understand it. He didn't have to. All that mattered was stopping them. The SWAT team opened fire, the roar of gunfire deafening in the tight space. Bodies dropped, but some kept moving even after taking multiple rounds. Too many bullets wasted before they figured out the only thing that worked. Frank grabbed 10B by the collar, shoving him toward the exit. "We need to get the hell out of here now." 10B didn't argue. He moved fast, dragging one of the wounded agents with him. Dana covered them, firing precise, controlled shots, each one hitting above the neck. The bodies fell like puppets with their strings cut. But they kept coming. Frank caught movement from the cockpit. A woman in a flight attendant uniform, her skin pale and sweaty, stumbled forward. At first, he thought she was another victim, one of the few who had somehow survived. Then he saw her eyes. Wide, dilated. Wrong. She charged. Frank fired. The bullet hit square between her eyes, and she dropped instantly. They reached the emergency exit. Dana slammed her hand against the hatch, yanking the lever, but it was jammed. "Damn it! Help me!" 10B shoved his rifle over his shoulder and grabbed the latch. Both of them pulled. The door screeched open. Cool desert air rushed in, blasting away the stench of rot. Frank turned, his rifle raised, ready to cover their exit. And then he saw him. Razor, not in a SWAT truck, not under arrest, standing on the tarmac, completely free. And he was smiling. Frank's blood went ice cold. Dana followed his gaze. What the? Razor raised a radio to his lips, then clicked a button. The world exploded. A blast ripped through the airstrip, sending a shockwave across the desert, knocking Frank off his feet. The concussive force slammed into the aircraft, tilting it sideways. Flames erupted from the opposite side of the plane. Something had been wired to detonate. The bodies inside didn't stop moving. Frank hit the ground hard, his vision blurring at the edges. His ears rang, the sound of the explosion leaving only a dull, suffocating silence. Razor's laugh cut through it all. Frank forced himself onto his elbows, blinking through the smoke. Razor stood near a row of SUVs, surrounded by more men. Not just gang members, mercenaries. It wasn't just the Black Reapers anymore. This was bigger. Dana coughed, pushing herself up, blood trickling from a gash on her forehead. She grabbed her radio, shouting into it. "We need immediate backup, now!" No response. Razor had jammed the frequency. Frank's mind raced, the plane, the bodies, the explosion. This wasn't about taking a flight hostage. This was a goddamn bio-weapon. Razor knew they would investigate. He knew the authorities would come for Flight 762, and now they were trapped. This was the real attack, not the hijacking, the ambush, Frank forced himself to his feet. "We need to move." Dana gritted her teeth. "We can't leave the plane unsecured. It's already lost," Frank growled. "If we stay, we die here." 10B helped the wounded SWAT officer to his feet. "He's right. We need to regroup. Fast." Razor took a step forward, raising his voice. "You finally seeing it, Dawson?" His tone was almost mocking. "All that work you put in stopping the hijacking, all that effort, and here you are, exactly where we wanted you." Frank didn't answer, because he was right. They had walked straight into the trap, and now they had to get out alive. Frank grabbed Dana by the shoulder, shoving her toward the nearest SUV. "We get to cover, we get comms back up, and we figure out where the hell this leads." Dana hesitated, only for a second. Then she nodded. They moved. Fast. Gunfire erupted from the mercenaries, bullets kicking up dirt and gravel as Frank ducked behind a row of cargo crates. Return fire cracked through the air, the SWAT team scrambling for cover. 10B slid next to Frank, reloading his rifle. "Any brilliant ideas?" Frank peered around the crates. Razor had too many men, too much firepower. They weren't going to win this fight head-on. "We hit them where it hurts," Frank muttered. 10B raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" Frank exhaled, his mind working through every possible way out of this. Then he looked toward the plane, the wreckage, the flames, and the cargo hold. "They want what's inside that plane," he murmured. "We make damn sure they don't get it." Dana crouched beside them, her eyes narrowing. "You're talking about a controlled burn." Frank nodded. "We rigged the rest of the aircraft to blow. Take whatever they were after off the board." Dana glanced at the burning wreckage. "We're barely standing as it is. How the hell do we pull that off?" Frank reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a single grenade. And 10B let out a breathless chuckle. "You really are old school, aren't you?" Frank smirked. "Let's give 'em a proper send-off." They moved fast. Razor's men were closing in. The plane was burning, and they had one shot to take control of the fight before it swallowed them whole. Frank pulled the pin and threw it straight into hell. The grenade arced through the smoke-filled air, spinning end over end, before disappearing into the open cargo hold of Flight 762. For a single, breathless second, everything was still. Then, with a deep, concussive boom, the belly of the aircraft erupted. A shockwave of heat and debris tore through the airstrip, engulfing the bodies inside the plane, turning whatever nightmare experiment had been hiding in that fuselage into nothing more than ash and flame. Frank Dawson barely had time to brace before the force of the explosion knocked him backward. He hit the ground hard, his ribs screaming in protest, his ears ringing. Smoke billowed high into the desert sky, thick and black, a signal of defiance that could be seen for miles. The bastards weren't getting whatever they had been after. Not tonight. Gunfire cracked through the chaos. Dana Reyes scrambled to her feet, gripping her rifle, dragging the wounded SWAT officer behind a row of cargo crates. "Move, move, move!" she shouted, voice barely cutting through the roar of flames. Frank pushed himself up, his muscles protesting every inch, his eyes locked onto the burning wreckage of the plane, the last remnants of the hijackers' twisted plan going up in smoke. But they weren't done, not yet. Razor was still alive. Frank turned toward the distant row of SUVs where Razor and his mercenaries had taken cover. Through the flickering haze of heat waves, he saw the man standing there, watching, his hands clenched into fists. His carefully laid-out operation had just been reduced to rubble, and yet he wasn't panicked. He wasn't afraid. He was waiting. Frank's gut twisted. Dana cursed under her breath. Why the hell isn't he running? Then, like an answer, the low rumble of approaching helicopters filled the air. Frank snapped his head up. 3 black choppers, no visible markings, moving in fast. "Shit," 10B muttered, reloading his rifle. "They have reinforcements." Frank didn't hesitate. "We need to get the hell out of here. Now!" Dana was already moving. She grabbed the SWAT officer, helping him toward one of the remaining SUVs. Frank followed, his knees screaming, but there was no time to feel pain. The helicopters were coming in low, the wash from their blades kicking up dust and sand, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The first burst of gunfire came from above. Bullets ripped into the ground, kicking up chunks of asphalt and dirt, forcing them into cover. Whoever was in those helicopters wasn't just here for extraction. They were here to eliminate loose ends. Frank ducked behind the SUV, heart pounding. This wasn't just a rogue biker gang anymore. This was bigger. Someone with military-grade resources had funded this operation. Someone who was willing to sacrifice an entire aircraft full of people just to deliver whatever the hell had been in that cargo hold. And now they were cleaning up. Dana shouted into her radio, "Reynolds, we are taking fire. We need air support now." Static. The radio was still jammed. Frank clenched his teeth. They were on their own. 10B peeked over the SUV, then ducked back down. They're moving forward, using the cover from the choppers. Frank weighed the options. They couldn't fight this out. Not with trained operatives in the air and on the ground. They had one shot at survival, and that was getting the hell out of there. "New plan," he grunted. "We use the chaos. Get to the canyon road, lose them in the terrain." Dana nodded sharply. "Let's move." 10B helped the wounded SWAT officer into the driver's seat of the SUV. "You good to drive?" The man grimaced, gripping the wheel with bloody fingers. "Not well." "It'll do," Frank muttered, climbing into the passenger seat. Dana and 10B jumped into the back, and before they had even slammed the doors shut, the SUV roared to life. The tires spun against the loose dirt, then caught traction, launching them forward. Bullets chased them, shattering the side mirrors, ripping into the metal. Then the first helicopter tilted sideways, its door gunner opening fire. The windshield exploded inward. Frank ducked. Glass rained over him, slicing into his arms, his face. The SWAT officer grunted in pain. The bullet grazing his shoulder, but he kept driving, jaw clenched. Dana twisted around in her seat, leveling her rifle at the chopper. "I need a clean shot." Frank's mind worked fast. "Bridge!" he shouted. Ahead, the old service bridge leading into the canyon was narrow, too tight for a helicopter to follow through. If they made it, they'd lose them in the ravine. The SUV skidded onto the gravel path, engine roaring, tires spitting dust. The chopper tilted, banking to follow. Dana fired. The round struck the tail rotor, and in an instant, the helicopter veered wildly, spinning out of control. For a second, Frank thought it might recover. Then it clipped the edge of the canyon wall. Boom! The explosion sent a fireball rolling into the sky as the wreckage tumbled down into the rocky abyss. "Go!" Frank shouted. The SUV lurched forward, barreling onto the bridge, racing across just as a second chopper swooped low. Too low. The pilot hesitated. The SUV cleared the bridge, and the helicopter didn't follow. Frank exhaled sharply as they hit the canyon road, twisting through the sharp turns, out of reach of aerial pursuit. Behind them, Razor's men were still at the airstrip, still stranded, still watching as their entire operation burned. For the first time since this started, Frank allowed himself to breathe. Dana let out a dry laugh, shaking glass from her jacket. "We made it!" Frank leaned his head back against the seat, his ribs aching. For now. The road stretched ahead, leading them deeper into the canyon, further from the chaos. But Frank wasn't celebrating, because he knew this wasn't the end, not even close. Dana turned to him, her voice softer now. "What do you think was really on that plane?" Frank stared out the window, the last wisps of black smoke rising from the airstrip behind them. "I think we were never supposed to find out." Silence settled over them. Then Dana muttered, almost to herself, "But someone already knows." Frank closed his eyes for a brief second, exhaustion creeping in. He had spent his entire life fighting wars that never truly ended. And now, somehow he had walked into one more. His fingers curled against his knee. His body ached. His mind was tired, but something told him he wasn't done yet. Not until they knew the truth, not until Razor paid for all of it, and not until whoever was behind this, whoever had been pulling the strings from the start, was finally exposed. The old soldier exhaled, and when he opened his eyes again, he was ready for the next battle. The SUV roared down the canyon road, engine growling as the dust billowed behind them. Frank Dawson sat in the passenger seat, his fingers curled against his knee, his body aching from the fight, the chase, and the years of war that had never truly left him. The reality of what they had just survived was settling in, but the weight in his gut told him one thing: this wasn't over. They weren't safe, not yet. Dana Reyes gripped the wheel, her knuckles white, jaw clenched. In the back seat, 10B was reloading his rifle, his fingers moving with the efficiency of a man who had spent too much of his life preparing for the next battle. The wounded SWAT officer beside him groaned, pressing a bloodied cloth against his shoulder. None of them spoke. There was no point. They all knew what was waiting for them at the end of this road. Razor was still out there, and whoever had backed this operation, whoever had planned the hijacking, the biological attack, the ambush, they weren't going to let it all fall apart without a fight. Frank checked his pistol, then looked at Dana. "Where are we headed?" She didn't take her eyes off the road. "Safe house just outside Santa Fe. FBI contact." "He's waiting for us," Frank frowned. "And you trust him?" Dana hesitated. "I trust that he wants to stop whatever the hell this is as much as we do." Frank didn't argue. He knew trust wasn't what mattered right now. Speed mattered. Getting ahead of the next move mattered. Because if this wasn't over, then the real danger was still coming. The radio crackled to life, static filling the cabin before a voice cut through. "This is Reynolds. We've got a problem." Dana cursed under her breath and grabbed the receiver. "Go, there's chatter. Someone planted a device, possibly a secondary detonation, at the Denver airstrip. Could be part of the cleanup effort, could be something worse." Frank's stomach twisted. "Define worse." There was a long pause on the other end of the radio. Then Reynolds spoke again, his voice lower. "Word is, it's not just an explosive, it's a failsafe. If Razor's men didn't make it out, they were going to make damn sure no one else did either." Silence filled the SUV. Then Dana muttered, "Dana, how much time?" "Unknown," Reynolds said. "But if it's active, we don't have long." Frank inhaled deeply. Razor had played them from the start. The hijacking, the missing plane, the crash site. They were all distractions. And now the final piece of the puzzle was waiting back, where they had just barely escaped with their lives. "We have to go back," Dana said. Frank didn't argue. He was already turning the SUV around. The sun was setting as they tore back toward the airstrip, headlights slicing through the dust, kicked up by their tires. Every muscle in Frank's body screamed in protest, but his mind was locked onto one thing. They had to stop whatever had been left behind, because if Razor had set a fail-safe, then it wasn't just meant to cover his tracks. It was meant to start something else. They reached the outskirts of the airstrip in record time, the SUV skidding to a stop behind a row of abandoned vehicles. The wreckage of Flight 762 still smoldered in the distance, its metal skeleton twisted and blackened. The bodies had been removed, but the stench of death lingered in the air. Frank moved first, gun drawn, eyes scanning the runway. "Where's the device?" Reynolds' voice crackled over the radio. "Heat signatures near the old fuel depot. That's your best bet." Dana nodded, moving beside Frank. "Let's go." 10B followed, rifle at the ready. The SWAT officer stayed behind, still too weak to fight, but ready to provide cover if needed. They moved fast, cutting across the open ground, hugging the shadows. The night air was thick, humid, the smell of scorched rubber and jet fuel burning in Frank's nostrils. Then he saw it. Near the rusted-out fuel tanks, half hidden beneath a stack of metal crates, was a black duffel bag, and next to it, a man. He was slumped against the crates, his breathing shallow, his shirt stained dark with blood. His fingers were weakly curled around the strap of the bag. His eyes flickered open as they approached. Frank aimed his gun. "Don't move!" The man coughed, his breath rattling in his chest. "You're too late." Dana stepped forward, kneeling beside him. "Where's the trigger?" The man smiled. His teeth were red with blood. "Already live." Frank's pulse spiked. The bomb was armed. Dana pressed her gun to the man's temple. "Where's the failsafe?" The man laughed weakly. "There isn't one." Frank's mind worked fast. They didn't have time for this. He shoved Dana back, moving to the bag, unzipping it in one swift motion. Inside, nestled between layers of protective casing, was a block of high-grade explosives and a timer. 30 seconds. His heart pounded. "We're out of time." Dana knelt beside him, eyes scanning the wires. "Can you disarm it?" Frank inhaled slowly. "Maybe." 10B crouched beside them, sweat beading on his forehead. "What do you need?" Frank's hands were steady as he traced the wires. Red, blue, yellow, one leading to the detonator, another to the power source. The circuitry was complex, but not military grade. This was meant to be rushed, crude, effective. He could work with that. 20 seconds. He grabbed his knife, flicking it open. "Hold the casing." Dana pressed down on the edge of the bomb, keeping it steady. 15 seconds. Frank found the main wire. His mind worked fast. Razor had planned this as a last resort, meaning he wouldn't have relied on a system that required too much complexity. The most direct wire was usually the right one. But if he was wrong, they'd all be vaporized in an instant. 10 seconds. He didn't have time to think. He cut the red wire. Silence. The timer froze at 7 seconds. The bomb didn't go off. Frank exhaled, his body sagging slightly. "It's done." Dana sat back, running a hand through her hair. "Jesus." 10B let out a long breath. "That was close." Frank looked down at the wounded man. His eyes were still open, but the life was already fading from them. His chest barely moved. He wasn't going to make it. Dana leaned over him. "Who sent you?" The man's lips curled slightly. "You'll see soon enough." Then his head rolled to the side. Dead. Frank stared down at him, the words lingering. It was the same thing Razor had said, the same thing the hijackers had repeated. This wasn't over. Dana stood, rolling her shoulders. "Let's get the hell out of here." Frank followed, but the weight in his gut told him something was still coming. They had stopped the bomb. They had survived the ambush. But they hadn't stopped the real attack. Not yet. And Frank had a terrible feeling the worst was still ahead. The drive back to the safe house was silent, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much. Frank Dawson sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the endless stretch of road, his thoughts heavy. The bomb had been disarmed, the threat neutralized for now, but he had been fighting long enough to know that just because a battle was over didn't mean the war was won. Dana Reyes gripped the wheel, her knuckles white, jaw tight. She hadn't spoken much since they left the airstrip, her mind clearly still turning over the same pieces of the puzzle Frank was. The bomb wasn't the endgame. Razor had made that clear. This had been a warning shot. Whatever was coming next would be worse. 10B sat in the back, silent, his rifle resting across his lap. He had chosen his side, but Frank knew that didn't make things simple. A man didn't just walk away from the kind of life he had lived without a cost. The weight of that decision was in his posture, in the way he kept his eyes on the road, avoiding conversation. The safe house was a cabin nestled deep in the New Mexico desert, far enough off the grid that it didn't officially exist. The kind of place built for disappearing. They pulled up just as the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon, painting the sky in a mix of pale blues and oranges. Frank stepped out first, stretching his aching limbs, ignoring the way his ribs protested the movement. Dana was already moving toward the door, her pace sharp, purposeful. The exhaustion hadn't caught up to her yet. It would eventually, but not yet. The man waiting for them inside was Warren Bishop, an FBI contact Dana had called in when things had spiraled out of control. He was older, maybe mid-50s, his suit wrinkled, his tie loosened. The kind of agent who had seen too much, survived too much, and knew better than to trust in easy solutions. "You look like hell," Bishop said, his gaze sweeping over the group as they entered. Dana dropped into a chair, rubbing at her temples. "Yeah, well, it's been a long night." Frank stayed standing, watching the man carefully. "You hear about the airstrip?" Bishop nodded. "I heard. The official story is that it was a cartel operation gone bad. Explosives, gunfight, bodies everywhere. Government's already cleaning it up, wrapping it in red tape so deep no one will ask the right questions." Frank exhaled slowly. "And the real story?" Bishop met his gaze, something dark in his expression. "You tell me, what the hell did you walk into?" Frank glanced at Dana. She gave him a small nod. So he told him. Everything. The hijacking of Flight 417, the connection to the missing Flight 762, the biological threat they had walked into on that plane, the bomb, the feeling that all of it had been something bigger, something moving just out of sight. By the time he was done, Bishop was rubbing a hand over his jaw, shaking his head. "Jesus Christ," Dana leaned forward. "We need answers, Bishop. Razor wasn't just some gang leader with a power complex. He was working with people who have resources, military-grade weapons, private security forces, and access to classified aviation details. That doesn't happen without someone powerful backing him." Bishop nodded, standing. He crossed the room, grabbing a thick folder from the table, tossing it onto the desk in front of them. "You're right. This is bigger than a hijacking." Frank opened the folder. The first page was a photo of Razor, taken before his arrest. He was standing beside a man in a military uniform. Frank stiffened. "Who's this?" Bishop's lips pressed into a thin line. "His name is Jonas Mercer, ex-Special Forces. Officially, he was dishonorably discharged 5 years ago. Unofficially, he disappeared. Turned up a year later working private security for a black-budget defense contractor. Then he disappeared again. No records, no trails, until now." Frank's gut tightened. He had seen Mercer's type before, the kind of soldier who didn't just stop when the war ended, the kind who found new wars to fight. Dana flipped through the documents. "You're saying Razor was working for him?" Bishop nodded. "And not just him. There's a network here. Mercenaries, rogue military units, criminal syndicates, all moving under the same banner." Frank leaned back. "For what?" Bishop's expression darkened. "We don't know yet. But whatever it is, Flight 762 was supposed to be the first domino." Silence filled the room. Then Dana exhaled. "And now we're on their radar." Bishop let out a dry chuckle. "Oh, you're more than that. You just wrecked their plans. You think they're going to let that slide?" Frank already knew the answer. "They'll come for us." Bishop nodded. "And soon." Dana stood, cracking her knuckles. "Good." Frank smirked. "You always this reckless?" Dana gave him a sharp grin. "Only when I don't have a choice." Bishop sighed. "I can get you temporary protection. But if these guys are who we think they are, that won't hold forever. You need to start thinking about your next move." Frank already was, because this wasn't about survival anymore. This was about finishing the fight before it even started. He looked at Bishop. "Where's Mercer now?" Bishop hesitated. "We don't know. Yet." Frank nodded. "Then find out." Bishop exhaled. "Jesus, Dawson, you really think you can take on these guys?" Frank's smirk was tired but certain. "I've taken on worse." Dana rolled her shoulders. "We hit first, before they regroup, before they know we're coming." Bishop hesitated. Then, slowly, he nodded. "All right, I'll dig." Frank pushed off the table, stretching out his back. The adrenaline was finally wearing off, the exhaustion creeping in, but he ignored it, because they had their next target, and if there was one thing Frank knew how to do, it was taking down a target. Hours later, as the sky darkened over the desert, Frank sat outside the cabin, watching the horizon. The night was quiet, but he knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Dana walked up beside him, a beer in hand, passing it to him without a word. He took it. "You get any sleep?" she snorted. "Do I look like I did?" Frank chuckled, taking a sip. The cold bite of the beer was a welcome contrast to the heat of the desert air. Dana exhaled, glancing at him. "So what happens next?" Frank looked out at the vast, empty desert, at the stars overhead, at the road ahead of them. "We find Mercer." Dana nodded. "And Frank Dawson, the old soldier, the man who had spent his life fighting battles other people didn't even know existed, sat back and let the quiet settle for just a moment longer, because he knew the next fight was already coming, and when it did, he'd be ready. Frank Dawson sat in the back of the SUV, watching the desert blur past, his fingers absently tapping against the grip of his pistol. He hadn't slept, he hadn't even tried. His mind was too sharp, too focused, already living in the next fight. He had spent his entire life chasing war, and for a while he thought war had finally outrun him. But now it had caught up, and if there was one thing he knew how to do, it was finish what others started. Dana Reyes drove in silence. Her eyes locked on the endless stretch of road ahead. The tension in her shoulders, the way she gripped the wheel just a little too tightly, told Frank that she was thinking the same thing he was. Mercer was out there, and they were going to find him. 10B sat in the back beside Frank, staring out the window, his rifle resting across his lap. His defection from Razor's crew had bought him a seat on this ride, but Frank knew better than to fully trust him yet. A man like 10B didn't change overnight, but he had made his choice back at the airstrip. He had turned his gun on his own people. That counted for something. Warren Bishop had given them a lead, a location, a black site buried under the bones of an abandoned prison just outside Albuquerque. It was off the books, off the radar, and the kind of place only dangerous men knew about. Mercer had been seen there 2 days ago. If they were lucky, he was still there. If they were unlucky, they were walking into another goddamn trap. Frank shifted in his seat, rolling his stiff shoulders. "You ready for this, Reyes?" Dana exhaled slowly. "I don't think I've been ready for anything since this started." Frank smirked. "Good. Keeps you sharp." The headlights of the SUV cut through the night as they approached the old prison. It was a relic of another time, a place where men had been forgotten, where walls had held ghosts long before Razor's people ever set foot inside. The perimeter was surrounded by rusted chain link, half-collapsed guard towers, looming like skeletal remains against the moonlight. Dana killed the engine a quarter-mile out. No lights, no movement. 10B clicked off the safety on his rifle. "Looks empty." Frank wasn't fooled. It's not. They moved quietly, keeping low as they approached the side entrance. The steel door was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. Someone had been here recently. Frank pressed his back against the wall, Dana on the opposite side, 10B just behind them. "You hear that?" he murmured. Dana frowned. "No." Frank's gut twisted. Exactly. Places like this had a sound. Wind through broken windows, metal groaning, the hum of a place left to rot. But this was too quiet. The air was thick with waiting. They moved in fast. Dana took point, sweeping the entry hall with her rifle, Frank right behind her. The air smelled of old concrete and oil, something chemical lurking beneath it. Then they heard it, a voice, weak, strained, A man. They followed the sound down a corridor, past old holding cells, where rusted bars cast jagged shadows across the floor. The voice grew louder until finally a figure, slumped against the wall, bound in chains, bloodied, bruised, but still alive. Frank felt something tighten in his chest. He knew this man, Johnny, the kid from Razor's crew who had hesitated, the one who had been too young, too scared, too human to belong to men like Razor. Dana cursed under her breath and moved fast, crouching beside him. "Johnny, can you hear me?" The young man stirred, his swollen eyes barely able to open. His breath was shallow, his body wrecked, but he was alive. "They knew," Johnny rasped. Frank crouched beside him. "Knew what?" Johnny's head lolled slightly. "That we'd come." Frank's stomach dropped. And then the lights snapped on. Floodlights blasted down the corridor, blinding them. A voice, cold and calm, echoed through the prison's decayed speakers. "Welcome, Dawson." Mercer. Frank's grip on his rifle tightened. Footsteps echoed from all around them. Shadows moved beyond the cell bars, men stepping out of the darkness, rifles in their hands. Dana spun, gun raised, but it didn't matter. They were surrounded. Mercer's voice hummed through the speakers, almost amused. "You think I didn't see you coming? You think I didn't know exactly who would be hunting me the second Razor failed?" Frank stayed still, his mind racing. How many men, how many ways out, how fast could they move? Mercer chuckled. "I don't blame you, you're just doing what you've always done, running toward the fire, trying to put it out." A pause. "But you're too late." Frank exhaled slowly. "That's so?" "Oh yes," Mercer said, his tone almost gentle. "You see, you've been chasing the wrong trail. You thought Flight 762 was the operation, but it wasn't." Frank's jaw clenched. It was the announcement. A single sharp beep cut through the air. Dana froze. "What the hell was that?" Mercer chuckled. "That, Detective Reyes, is what comes next." Another beep. A timer. Frank's blood ran cold. Mercer sighed, almost disappointed. "I wanted you to see it, to really understand, but I suppose you'll have to settle for hearing it." Frank's mind raced. The bomb at the airstrip. Was this another? Where? "What did you do?" Dana growled. Mercer chuckled. "Oh, Detective, it's not what I did. It's what's already happening." Another beep, a countdown. Frank acted. He grabbed Johnny by the collar, yanking him up, throwing the kid's arm over his shoulder. "We're leaving, now!" Dana fired the first shot, dropping the closest man. 10B was already moving, his rifle spitting fire down the corridor. The prison exploded into chaos. Mercer's voice crackled through the speakers, almost amused. "Run all you want, Dawson. It's already too late." Frank didn't stop to listen. Because Mercer wasn't wrong. Something was happening. And whatever it was bigger than all of them. They just had to live long enough to find out what it was. Frank didn't look back. He just ran. The gunfire followed them as they ran, bullets ricocheting off the rusted prison walls, kicking up chunks of concrete, filling the air with dust and chaos. Frank Dawson gritted his teeth, one arm wrapped around Johnny's shoulders, dragging the barely conscious kid through the corridor. The echoes of Mercer's voice still lingered in his ears, the cold certainty of a man who knew he had already won. Dana Reyes was at his side, moving fast, her rifle firing controlled bursts, keeping the mercenaries pinned as they sprinted toward the exit. 10B was ahead, clearing the path, his movements sharp, ruthless, efficient. Whatever doubts Frank had about the man were gone now. They didn't have time for doubts. Johnny groaned, his weight sagging against Frank. I can walk." Frank didn't let go. "Yeah? Then keep moving." The prison was a labyrinth of decayed stone and rusted steel, corridors that twisted and turned, each one a potential death trap. Mercer had them herded, cutting off paths, pushing them toward whatever ending he had planned. But Frank had spent his life escaping places just like this. He wasn't about to stop now. Dana slammed open a side door, leading them into what had once been a loading bay. The moonlight cut through the broken roof, exposing rows of abandoned vehicles, stacks of rotting wooden pallets, and Frank's pulse spiked. The gates were already closing. 10B cursed under his breath. They're sealing us in. Frank's mind moved fast. If they were locking the gates, it meant they wanted them alive. That meant Mercer wasn't done with them yet. That meant there was still time. We need to move, Dana snapped. Now! Frank shoved Johnny toward 10B. Get him out of here. 10B didn't argue. He hauled Johnny up, gripping him under the arm, moving fast toward the gate. Dana fired another burst behind them, keeping the mercenaries at bay, then followed. Frank stayed behind, covering their retreat, his pistol kicking against his palm as he emptied round after round into the shadows. A scream, a body dropped, but more were coming. The gate was nearly shut. Dana reached it first, slamming her hand against the control panel, hitting every button she could find. Nothing. The mechanism had been locked. 10B skidded to a stop beside her. We're not making it through. Frank wasn't listening. He had one chance. He turned, eyes scanning the bay, looking for anything that could stop the gate, delay the closing, buy them even a few extra seconds. Then he saw it. An old forklift, rusted but intact, parked near the far wall. Frank didn't think. He moved. "Cover me," he growled. Dana didn't question it. She spun, dropping to one knee, her rifle barking fire as Frank sprinted toward the forklift. The keys were still in the ignition, a miracle. He twisted them, and the engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. Frank slammed his foot down on the pedal, gripping the steering wheel tight as the machine lurched forward. The gate was inches from sealing shut. Frank gunned it. The forklift slammed into the steel barrier, jamming itself between the metal doors just as they clamped shut. Gears screeching, sparks flying. For a second, nothing happened. Then, a groan of metal. The gate stalled. Dana and 10B moved. They yanked Johnny through first, then followed, slipping through the narrow gap, emerging onto the outer perimeter of the prison. Frank climbed out of the forklift, rolling his shoulders, then ducked through the opening. The second he was clear, the gate slammed shut behind him. They were out, but Mercer's men weren't far behind. Frank grabbed Dana's arm. "Where's the truck?" 10B pointed toward the tree line. "Quarter-mile out. We parked outside the main perimeter." They ran. The desert stretched ahead. Endless and dark, the air thick with dust and gunpowder. Frank could hear the mercenaries behind them, their boots pounding against the ground, but they weren't firing anymore. They wanted them alive. That only made Frank run faster. The truck was exactly where they had left it, hidden behind a ridge of rock. Out of sight. 10B yanked open the door, shoved Johnny inside. Dana was already behind the wheel, engine roaring to life. Frank barely had time to throw himself into the passenger seat before the tires spun against the dirt, launching them forward. Gunfire erupted behind them. Bullets ripped into the rear of the truck, shattering the back window. Johnny let out a pained grunt, gripping his side. Dana yanked the wheel, skidding the truck into a sharp turn, kicking up a wall of dust behind them. Then they were gone. The prison disappeared behind them, swallowed by the night. Frank exhaled slowly, leaning back against the seat, his heart pounding. They had made it. Barely. Johnny groaned from the back. "Jesus, you guys always party like this?" Dana let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head. "Shut up, Johnny." Silence filled the truck, the only sound the hum of the tires against the desert road. Frank turned toward Dana. "You know he's right, though," she raised an eyebrow. "About what?" Frank smirked. "We do have a habit of crashing every place we visit." Dana snorted. "Yeah, well, it's starting to get old." Frank chuckled, then winced as the pain in his ribs reminded him that he wasn't 20 anymore. 10B glanced at him. "So, what's the plan now?" Frank sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "We find Mercer, and we finish this." Dana nodded. "And if we can't find him?" Frank's smirk returned, colder this time. "Then we make damn sure he finds us first." The road stretched ahead, leading them deeper into the unknown. The fight wasn't over, not even close. But for the first time since this started, they weren't just running, they were hunting. The air was thick with dust and the scent of blood, the echoes of the past few days lingering like ghosts in the quiet desert night. Frank Dawson stood outside the cabin, staring into the flickering glow of a small fire they had built in a rusted old barrel. The flames danced against the darkness, their light barely touching the weight pressing against his chest. Dana Reyes sat on an overturned crate a few feet away, a half-empty bottle of whiskey resting in her lap. She wasn't drinking fast, just enough to take the edge off, enough to let herself feel it, the loss, the bodies they had left behind, the ones they hadn't been able to save. She hadn't said much since they had escaped Mercer's trap, and Frank didn't push. Some grief needed space. Johnny sat on the porch steps, his arms resting on his knees, bandages wrapped around his ribs from the wound he had taken during their escape. His face was still swollen, bruised from Mercer's men using him as bait. He looked younger now, somehow even smaller, like the weight of everything had finally caught up to him. He wasn't a kid anymore. Not after this. He never would be again. 10B leaned against the truck, his rifle resting against the bumper, watching the fire with a distant expression. He hadn't spoken much either, and Frank understood why. He had crossed a line, turned his back on the men he had once called his brothers. That kind of betrayal didn't just sit inside you. It carved a space, hollow and sharp, and stayed there forever. Frank took a slow breath and reached into his jacket, pulling out a battered old flask. He unscrewed the cap, took a sip, the burn in his throat a reminder that he was still alive. He passed it to Dana, without a word. She took it, nodding once in thanks. Before taking a swig, they had lost people, good people. And for what? The real fight hadn't even started yet. Mercer was still out there, and so was the machine behind him, the shadow network that had orchestrated everything from the beginning. This wasn't just a gang war. This wasn't just a hijacking. This was a power shift. Frank had seen it before. In different countries, under different names, different flags. When people with too much ambition decided the world needed to be remade in their image, they didn't just take control, they burned everything that stood in their way. Dana exhaled through her nose. I keep thinking about the passengers. Frank didn't answer. He knew what she meant. Flight 417, Flight 762, the bodies left behind in the wreckage, people who had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time, civilians caught in a war they didn't even know existed. We did what we could, he finally said. Dana let out a dry laugh. Did we? Frank's grip tightened around the flask. We stopped the plane, she continued. We stopped the bomb. And for what? Mercer's still out there. Razor's in a cage, probably already working on his way out. And we're sitting here like we actually won something. Johnny shifted on the steps, his voice quiet. We're alive. Dana shook her head. And how many aren't? Silence. Frank exhaled slowly, watching the fire crackle, letting the flames eat away at the cold inside his chest. He had seen so many faces over the years, faces of men who had followed him into battle, who had never come back. Their ghosts lived in the corners of his mind, waiting for moments like this to remind him that no matter how many fights he won, he would never save them all. But he could damn well try. He turned to Dana. You know what happens when you lose people? She didn't answer. Frank continued. You remember them, and then you keep moving, because if you don't, then you might as well have died with them. Dana didn't look at him, but she took another sip from the flask, her fingers gripping the metal tightly. Johnny rubbed at his temple. So what now? Frank looked at him, at the bruises, at the bandages, at the kid who had barely made it out alive. And yet here he was, still asking about the next fight. Frank sighed. Now we find Mercer. 10B glanced up. You sure he's still in play? Frank nodded. Oh, he's still in play. That stunt he pulled at the prison? That was just his opening move. Whatever comes next is already in motion. Dana finally looked at him. Then we need to get ahead of it. Frank smirked. That's the plan. They weren't running anymore. They weren't just reacting. They were taking the fight to them. He turned back to the fire, pulling something from his pocket. A small, folded piece of paper. He stared at it for a long moment, then tossed it into the flames. It was a list of names, people they had lost. The ink curled, blackened, disappeared into embers. Frank closed his eyes for a brief second. Then he let them go. Because the dead didn't need him anymore. The living did. Frank Dawson stood at the edge of the desert, the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon, casting long shadows across the dust and stone. The wind was still, the silence stretching in every direction, but his mind was anything but quiet. It never was. Not after everything. Not after this war that had landed in his lap when he thought he was done with all that. But war didn't care about age. It didn't care that his body ached in ways it never had before. It didn't care that the ghosts of men he had lost still whispered in the back of his mind. War just was. And men like Frank, they didn't walk away from it. Behind him, the cabin was waking up. Dana Reyes was moving inside, the sound of a coffee pot gurgling through the walls. 10B was cleaning his rifle, methodical, precise, like a man who knew the fight wasn't over yet. And Johnny, the kid, was still asleep, healing, recovering. He had been thrown into a fire that he never should have been near, and yet he had walked out of it, barely. But he was still standing, and that counted for something. Frank exhaled, rubbing his thumb over the scar on his knuckle, staring out at the endless stretch of desert. They had survived. But survival wasn't the same as winning. Razor was locked up, but that wouldn't last. Mercer had vanished, but not without leaving them a message. Flight 762 had burned, but whatever it was meant to start hadn't been stopped. They had cut off the arm of a monster they didn't fully understand, and now the beast was regrouping. Dana stepped outside, a steaming cup of coffee in her hand. She leaned against the railing of the porch, watching him. "You're thinking too loud, old man." Frank smirked, glancing over. "You get some sleep?" She took a sip. "Not much." "Figured." They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the distant rustle of wind moving over the dry earth. Dana set her coffee down on the railing. "You think they're coming?" Frank didn't hesitate. "Yeah." She nodded, like she'd already expected that answer. "So, what do we do?" Frank turned, looking back toward the cabin, toward the people inside. "We get ready." 10B stepped out next, rolling his shoulders, eyes still heavy with exhaustion. "You got a plan?" Frank exhaled slowly, letting the weight of it settle in his chest. "Yeah, we don't wait for them to find us. We find them first." Dana raised an eyebrow. "That sounds like an awfully bad idea." Frank smirked. "You got a better one?" She didn't answer, because they all knew the truth. They weren't just some unlucky survivors who had stumbled into the wrong fight. They were in this now, whether they wanted to be or not. Johnny finally stepped outside, squinting against the sunlight. His movements were slow, careful, but he was up. That was something. He let out a dry chuckle. "Damn, you guys look like hell." Dana shook her head, picking up her coffee again. "You look worse." Johnny stretched, wincing at the pain in his ribs. "Yeah, well, I don't bounce back like I used to." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Kid, you're barely 20. Johnny grinned. "Tell that to my body." There was something about the exchange, the normalcy of it, that almost made Frank forget. Almost. But then the reality settled back in. The war wasn't over. It had just changed shape. Dana leaned against the railing again. "You ever think about stopping?" Frank looked at her. "Stopping what?" "All this. The fight, the war. Walking away." Frank took a breath. "Yeah, I've thought about it." She tilted her head. "And?" He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "And every time I try, trouble finds me first." Dana chuckled, shaking her head. "That's a hell of a way to live." Frank smirked. "Yeah, but it's the only way I know." Johnny sat down on the porch steps, looking out at the desert. "So what now?" Frank took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment. "Now we stop waiting for the fight to come to us." Johnny frowned. "And go where?" Frank turned toward the truck, toward the road stretching out into the unknown. "Wherever the next battle is." Dana exhaled through her nose. "You ever get tired of this?" Frank smirked. "Yeah." She shook her head. "And yet, here you are." Frank took one last look at the sunrise, at the quiet that wouldn't last, at the moment of peace that was already slipping away. Then he turned, grabbing his jacket, heading toward the truck. Because this was his life, and war never really ends.